Sorry, boy, but his captain's got to teach his men what happens to those what crossing.
Captain's got to teach stuff.
Good morning from the Batcave. It is Friday. It is July 25th, 2025, and I want to jump right back on the Serpent by the Way research with you guys and kind of just walk you through my process of what I'm looking at historically, genetically, linguistically, and all this stuff to kind of get to where I am and focus on where I am today. And so from here going forward, when I get on Serpent by the Way stuff, just because I'm doing a bunch of research and writing, but I'm kind of forgetting what I last talked about, and obviously I'm revising stuff as I go, I'm going to try to keep referring to this genetic map as kind of a starting point to go, okay, here's what I'm talking about today. So you can kind of see that there's genetic evidence of these people groups being where I think they are, and this is where my theories are coming from. So I'm going to start out with this. This is on wikimedia.org, but it's just called the World Map of Y-DNA Haplogroups, okay? Now, I am not going to pretend to know more about genetics than I am. I am just looking at this map with no education on the subject and just looking at the dispersion, and this is just pure pattern recognition. So if somebody knows more about genetics than me and they want to get on here and say, hey, dude, you're an idiot. Like, you should know blah, 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 blah. Like, that's fine. I'm happy to hear that. But I'm going to tell you what I'm going to call BS on this thing, and I'm going to tell you what I think is generally accurate on this thing, okay? Now, what these people are doing to make this map is they're taking DNA samples from people in the past decade or two, and then they're drawing a map that they believe goes back literally 100,000 years or more. I think, let's see, 200,000 years ago. So you see they got Y-DNA atom here, which they believe emerged from Niger. Okay. I used to hear Kenya back in the day, but now they're saying Niger. Okay. 200,000 years ago. And so what they think is they're taking genetic samples of all these people all over the world in the past 20 years, and they're saying this is where they came from as far back as 200,000 years ago. That's absurd. I'm going to tell you why that's absurd. Now, you're going to have some continuity to this thing because you're going to have people groups who tend to remain even when other peoples are conquering them, because you're going to have women kidnapped and, and raped or taken as wives or slaves or whatever. And that genetic mixture is going to remain in the population. People don't just tend to come in and then just wipe out all the women and children and everything and leave no trace of the genetics that were there before them. So there's going to be some truth to this. But the idea of like these Khoisan people who are migrating around southern Egypt are basically the same genetics that came from Y-DNA atom with, some variation from 200,000 years ago, even though they've been colonized in the past 200 years by white people and pushed aside and apartheided and all this other stuff, but somehow that's just clear that they were always there for hundreds of thousands of years, and there's no question about that. And of course the Australian Aborigines were always there for 60,000 years, and even though all these people have come in and colonized in the past 100 years, well, they remained in perfect isolation without any contact with the outside world or infusion of other genetics for 60,000 years. It's just absurd to think that happened. If they can get there, why can't other people get there? And so the fact that some of these genetic mixtures are so tight and so common should lead you to some common sense that this is not that old. It's not 60,000 years old. It's more like 4,000 years old, which is how old it is. Most of this dispersion is going to take place after the flood. That's all they have genetic evidence of. Okay? They're going to have genetic evidence that goes back to, most of this stuff is going to be post-Babel, so 1700 BC, so that's going to be roughly 3,700 years ago from today. Some of it is going to go back to as much as maybe 500 years beyond that, so let's say 4,200 years max, okay? Now, it's a lot easier to believe that, well, there was an ice age after the flood, and you see all these peoples kind of corralled down under here, under this parallel, if you will, until those ice ages recede. And once they recede, there's a much smaller dispersion of populations that remains mostly homogenous to this day. Okay, and we'll get into who these different groups are right now. But I mean, but then we got people like this Q2Q, so they're in the Turkmen. They're up here in Siberia. They're also over here in South America. So how do we have these people from here to here, but we know that these people have been the same since Y-DNA Adam? It's stupid to think like that unless it's a much narrower time frame. So what you probably had is an ice age down to like here after the flood, and there's pretty substantial evidence of that. And that's why you're going to have these people up here, and we're going to talk about this Aksu civilization wearing huge, fat, heavy dress. And these people are going to migrate up here. You're going to have land bridges here as the ice is melting and get down here. And so you're going to have a migration of these people that's going to be pretty peaceful. And then you're going to have a migration that happens after the Tower of Babel, which is going to bring other peoples in here on top of these people. And these people are going to practice human sacrifice and stuff like this. And where they go, people stop migrating through their turf because they're known to kidnap people and practice human sacrifice. They're like the Canaanites, okay? And it's by that time, see how you have two different infusions of people here in Australia? It's by that time that these land bridges are disappearing because the ice age is melting and these people are getting isolated into their islands and stuff like this. But notice how you have people like, here's K. K is all the way over here, all the way over here, all the way over here. O is all up in China, all the way down here in Singapore. M is over here in Papua New Guinea and over here. And so these people are mixing into these islands because there once was a land bridge where they're all mixing together. And then these families isolated themselves in different islands and these land bridges disappeared. But then you have like C2, 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 C1, C3, these peoples that got out to these islands also went all the way over here to the Americas. And I believe probably Q was the first group that came, and then C was the second group that came. And these people are going to produce the Mesoamericans, I believe. It looks like you have some of them coming into South and Central America. But I believe these are going to produce the Mesoamericans. I could be mistaken. It could be the reverse of that, but it seems like they're Sinitic, so the same ethnic roots that the Chinese are, and then Zemorites, which are the same ethnic roots as the Sumerians. Those who are, I believe, represent this Q and the C. This R1B represents Europeans coming over here, but we're going to show you something. We've got R1 right here. This is the Aksu civilization, which is the main Japhethite hub up until the Tower of Babel. And after that, they're going to disperse over here. And you see this R1, R1A and R1B. These are representing your Germanic peoples. And they're also going to mix with other peoples that would have been there previously, which are primarily Greek peoples. But you notice how there's two strains. You see a dark blue and a light blue. But that light blue is representing largely the coming of the Germanic peoples, the Gothic peoples and stuff like this, who are going to be pushed over here by the Huns, and then they're going to ultimately push up into England, into Iceland, and then they're going to push over here into the Americas eventually through, the English, and remember the Anglo-Saxon, all these people are Germanic peoples. So that's why you have this here. So you have this big, huge mystery here. Why do you have this R1B here down here in Chad in the middle of this? Well, I'm going to tell you some common sense here. This is not a 50,000 years ago, some Germanic people came all the way to here in Chad and then they isolated themselves down here and somehow managed to stay there for so long that there's a substantial evidence of them being centralized around here in Chad. No. The Vandals, which are going to be part of these groups that come through here, the Goths and the Vandals, are going to come down here and raid all the way down to Spain, and then they're eventually going to go into North Africa. And so they're going to cross this land bridge, go into North Africa, and they're going to take out Carthage. Well, after that, and it's about 100, 150 years after that, the Muslims are going to come in. And notice you see all this green right here. These Muslims, this is not thousands and thousands of years ago. This is 1,300 years ago. The Muslims are going to come in here and they're going to take over all of this to the north. And what you see here are Arabs. This green is Arabs. And these Arabs are going to take over all of Egypt, Sudan, this western part over here. And then they're going to take over Carthage. And it looks like they're going to even get up into southern Italy, or at least there's going to be genetic sharing with people who got up into southern Italy, which the Carthaginians did. Okay. You're also going to have, notice you see J1, J2, J3 here. There's going to be Canaanites because the Carthaginians are Canaanites, so they're going to be mixed in with that. What these represent is the Vandals, who are probably, when the Muslims took over all this up here in the north, they were probably pushed south to get away from the Muslims because they were the dominant group before the Muslims. And they probably got pushed south down here, and they probably just formed an enclave and just kept interbreeding with the married people around them. And so you have these Germanic genetics that are trapped down here in Africa. That would be my guess of where these people come from. I doubt that there were just some Germans who just plowed their way right into the middle of Africa without any trade routes to the relatives and stuff like that way, 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 way back in the day. I think they started over here and were pushed south by the Muslims. Once the Muslims took all this, they couldn't get back on boats and get back up into here. And by the time the Muslims had taken all this, their relatives up here had been conquered by the Franks. So they were getting pushed out of here, and the Muslims were here, and it basically ended up with a war between the Muslims and the Franks over Spain for hundreds and hundreds of years. That this is not going to get cleared until I think it's like, I forget the Spanish Crusades, but this is right before the Reformation, where the Roman Catholics take this back with basically French Germanic peoples. And so we see no trace of them here, even though they were here for hundreds of years. So we see people getting pushed out, and there's really no genetic trace or substantial genetic trace of these people in there. And yet we have things where there's always been a tight mixture of people, like right here where the Ark was, right here where the Oxus civilization was, right here where Sumer and Akkad was. And then you see this mixture over here, which is, now why do we have people that seem to be from Africa, seem to be from these, I would expect that these are probably Hebrews right here, because notice you have them coming up here where Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees, down into here into the Promised Land, down into Egypt, and then over here. Those are probably Danites. You have these other people coming up here, it seems, over here and over here. These are probably Canaanite peoples. Because you have the Hittites over in here, you have the Sumerians that are going to be all up in here, and they're going to migrate up, some of them with Abraham and his family, and then you see them going over here, and these are probably the Hurrian peoples. You notice you have a J1 up in here. You probably have connections with these people, with the Mitanni and the original descendants of Noah and Japheth over here. But this is going to be your main Japhethite core right here until the Tower of Babel. And what we have here, rather than representing Y DNA Adam, like this is where we all came from, what you probably have here, this is my theory that I'm putting in my book, is that you have these people called Punt who are right here. And I believe Punt becomes the Bantu, okay? And these are going to be some of the first seafaring people that are going to be transporting across the Red Sea. They're going to be these fisher peoples, and they're going to become the modern Eritreans and stuff like this, or that's where their lands were. And they're probably shipping between the Harappan civilization down here, Sumer right here, and Africa right here. And so you have these people that have connections all the way to here, which means they're probably marrying in with people all the way to here. And since these were the major beginning civilizations, their genetic mix is going to be in with a lot of people. Well, the Cushites are going to migrate in a big way all across Africa later, but earlier on, they're going to be the ones who come into India, and they're going to become these Dravidians, and that's going to be Rama and Shiva. If you remember, you're going to have Ham, Cush, Rama, and Shiva come over here, and possibly Canaan. And so these people are going to come over here. They're going to get pushed south by the Indo-Iranians. That's not why they're not as much represented anymore. But we've been digging up this Harappan civilization and digging up tombs and dating stuff and getting genetic material where we can. And there's probably some evidence over here of these people. Notice you have L and T down here. You have L up here, okay? These people are going to spread initially across Arabia, at least the southern part, and have colonies up here in what we would call Yemen, Oman. They called it Dilmun, where Qatar is, and then up into here. So you're going to have these people coming up here. Notice you have T over here, and then you have T over here, which these are going to be probably the descendants of Rama, and these up here are probably the descendants of Shiva, okay? Which is why you're going to have the Ramayana pop up over here. Rama as a god is going to be more prominent over here. Shiva as a god is going to be more prominent over here. So LT is probably Rama and Shiva. And again, I am open to revision on this. I am open to people correcting me on this. This is just loose speculation based on what we know from the Bible and what we see on this map. That's it, okay? So what do we have over here that makes them think this is DNA Adam? Well, these people of Punt are known to trade in ivory and ebony, okay? Well, ebony is a wood that grows around here, but ivory comes from animal tusks. Well, if they're hunting the animal tusks and taking them, guess what these animals are going to do? They're going to migrate away. And that's why you're going to have these elephant migrations all the way over into here, all the way over into here. And what they're doing is they're following the elephant migrations to get these tusks across Africa. And then they're, keeping track of their tracks back to their people, because they can trade that stuff here for whatever they're using for money or trade. And then those people go on to trade ivory all the way over here into Elam, all the way over here into Sumer, all the way over here into Arabia, okay? And we have records of this stuff from Ezekiel 27, where it gets into all the stuff that's traded from Rama and Shiva and from Africa and stuff like this. They don't mention Punt by name, but they do mention stuff that is going to come from the region where Punt is. I believe it's called Sheba at that time, because the kingdom of Sheba is going to be over both sides of the Red Sea at that time. But when these guys decide, okay, hey, we're over here collecting animal tusks all the time, and our main civilization over here, that's where we ship it to everybody else, okay? So we're crossing Africa on the regular. What we need to have is a civilization right here where we're growing our own farm goods and stuff like this, and that's going to be our main hub, and that's where we, take care of ourselves in between our hunting trips, and then our merchants go across Africa here to bring the elephant tusks to make the good money, okay? That's what they've got going on. That is the mainstay of their trade, it seems. And so what you end up having here is this civilization form in the Niger-Congo Delta, which is going to advance farming beyond, we're just throwing some seeds in the ground and watching them grow and gathering them later, okay? Now, it seems like most of the tactical farming, and I mean advanced irrigation, I mean genetically cross-pollinating seeds and stuff like that to produce better crops and stuff like that, comes from Sumer, and it comes from the antediluvian knowledge that they dug up in Sumer. And so these people seem to, you find in the days of Nimrod, it gets brought up here into Assyria. Why? Probably because Noah and the other people didn't know this knowledge. Remember, Noah is more of a craftsman than a farmer. He's building a huge boat. So he's probably good at woodworking, and he's probably good at metalworking and stuff like that, because he needs to be to build this boat. And Japheth seems to be the one who he teaches most of that to. But he's not an OG farmer, because he's living up here in the mountains of Turkey, where there's not a lot of advanced farming going on. So what we have here at Gobleki Tepe, notice how there's a whole bunch of dispersion from the Gobleki Tepe region. That's probably because this is originally where they all settled. And so you have these people, you see the arrows going up here, but what you really probably have is arrows coming down from here and then going back up here. Notice you've got, it looks like these same people who are going to go into the Middle East, over into Africa. These are probably Canaanites, I'm guessing. But you see them coming back up into here. Well, this is where they all came from. And so they come down here and they go down here, and here's where they chill, and then they disperse from here. Well, what we have here is what they think is 12,000-year-old attempts to recultivate the grains that they had down here in abundance, and they also had all the way over here in this place called Magar in abundance. So these were the original cultivated grains that, remember, when God gives Adam the task of you guys are going to live off the herb of the field, they're figuring out how to make these grains fatter and fatter and fatter by comparing the good seeds with the bad seeds. And so when they save seeds to grow next year, what are they going to do? They're going to save the fattest ones. Save all the fattest seeds, and we'll grow those next year. And next year's crop is going to be fatter and fatter and fatter and fatter. This is what they did with corn. If you look at corn just hundreds of years ago, just 150 years ago versus today, like look at this. This is corn. This is what they figured out how to do with corn over time. So these big, fat, yellow corns that are ruining all our food, putting corn syrup and everything and making us all fat and ugly, it started out as this little stuff, this little grain. In fact, wheat used to be called corn. And they don't genetically modify it. They just breed it until the fattest seeds come forth, and the fattest seeds come forth, and eventually you have something like this. Why does this happen? Because these are designed to shrink over time genetically where there's little water and grow over time where there's much water and human intention on it. And so God has designed these seeds to survive all over the world in harsh climates. But once you start irrigating and cultivating, you can, over the course of a century, make it look like this. There's a whole Little House on the Prairie episode about how corn comes in, okay? But the Indians had it for a long time, and it wasn't as great. Well, then the Europeans come in with their farming tactics that are even more advanced, and they figure out this is in the early scientific age in the 1800s, and they figure out how to turn it into Indian corn, which you've probably seen with the blue and yellow and multicolored stuff that's kind of small and kind of tough, into this big fat yellow corn. Okay, this is just the intentional crossbreeding, just like you can do with animals, you can do it with plants. Okay. So they find evidence of this. They find evidence of this over here in Gobleki Tepe, and then they're like, this must be the oldest place where these people were building. They're hunter-gatherers, but they were building these massive stone monolithic structures. No, you idiot. These are people who came out of the flood who are digging up these massive stone monolithic structures and then trying to recultivate grains for the first time because they just cut off an ark. And they're saving their seeds to cultivate grain, and they're like, okay, here's where we're going to settle. Let's try to start cultivating grain again. But they don't get very far because they start digging up all this crazy phallic cult stuff where they are, and Noah orders it reburied. Okay? We're going to leave this place. We're not going to make our settlement where there's a massive phallic Nephilim cult right up the hill. We're not going to do this because people are going to get curious. Next thing you know, we're going to have Nephilim coming back. And he was right, because that's exactly what the Canaanites do within probably, I'm going to say definitely within 300 to 400 years of the flood, they do it. Probably started before that, because you have tribes of Nephilim existing in Canaan by the time Noah dies. And Noah's going to die about 350 years after the flood. Okay? So within 300 years, they're making Nephilim. So it's not crazy to think that within 100 years, they discover a Nephilim cult, and they're like, we're burying this thing and we're moving. And he basically orders them to disperse from there. And that's why you see a general dispersion of Japhethites to the north, Semites to the middle. And they actually called this region, which we call the Middle East today, they called it Middle Earth. I'm actually reading this in the Atrahasis. They called this Middle Earth. And then to the south would have been the Hamites, okay? So Japhethites to the north, Semites to the middle, and Hamites to the south. And so the Hamites are going to go down into Africa first. The Japhethites are actually going to be over here, but they're going to go under the Caspian Sea over into what they call the BMAC, or the Bactria Margiana complex, because here's why. Noah is crafty, okay? Noah knows how to make stuff with his hands. Japheth seems to be his favorite kid in terms of just having the most in common. Shem seems to be the one that's most noble. And so because Shem was the one who was responsible for covering up Noah when he was naked, Japheth seems to get the blessing because he followed with him. Shem seems to get the priestly leadership because he's covering his shame. Okay? This is what sin is. This is what priesthood is about. It's about interceding for people for forgiveness for their sins. Okay? And so he's covering Noah's shame, and he's like, he's the natural. He's going to be the priest. So Shem becomes the priest. Japheth becomes the one that Noah seems to pour in all his crafting knowledge to. And so Noah is buried up here in, I believe one is in Armenia and one is in Azerbaijan. So they're right by each other, okay? Japheth seems to go over here and start this Bactrium Margiana complex. And Japheth, if he's around Shem's age, he's going to live to be somewhere around 500 years after the flood as well. Which means that's going to put him within probably a century before the Tower of Babel when he dies. Same with, no, I'm sorry, yeah. Within about a century before the Tower of Babel, Shem and Japheth are going to die, okay? Before Shem and Japheth die, they are going to put forward a united effort to take out Nimrod's empire. And so this takes some time because you're going to see we've gotten in the Sumerians kings list, and you see how this king of Kish, which is the first place he overthrown, you have like a few kings later, his name means Ishmi Shamash, or Shamash has heard, okay? Well, Shamash actually breaks down to the name Shem, Sham or Shem or Shum. You're going to see different variations, but it all just means the name. And then Ash means he is. He is, okay? So it's Shem of he is, okay? So remember, God is called I am. Shem of he is, the existent one. Okay, that's what he is. And you find this in later Japhethite stuff, as they would call him the it is, okay? Because they see God as more of a principle or a force than a person. But Ash, or Esh, means he is, okay? Which is why when you have in like Sumerian in these ancient languages, they're like Enush, Enosh, is basically saying and is priest king. He is the priest king, okay? So the priest king is established. That's a way of saying he's established. The priest king is established. Enosh is the first priest, okay? Well, Shamash is it means the name he is. And this is why the Jews are going to call him Hashem. Hashem just means the name. It's the shortened form, okay? So they don't say he is, they say the name. They just say the name. And Shamash becomes this sun god. Well, Japheth is known all over too. And Japheth is this crafty guy. And because your original crafty guy before the flood was Tubal-Cain, their legends are going to be merged together. Okay? So Tubal-Cain is the guy who's first working with metals and he's figuring it out, but Japheth is doing that after the flood. And so Japheth, now you're going to pay attention. So you have J, which is going to be sometimes an I or a Y in different cultures. P-T-H, okay? P-T-H, Japheth, okay? In Egypt, he's Ptah. In the Greeks, he's Hephaestus, okay? Remember, the Greeks are going to put an S on the everything. So he's Japheth-us, okay? Japhestus, okay? Hephaestus. So he's Hephaestus to the Greeks, he's Ptah to the Egyptians, and all the way down into Alexander the Great's day, they understood that was the same guy. He's the god of crafting. And what he becomes in the Egyptian pantheon is the god who made all the other gods. Okay? He also is Jupiter. That is Japheth. And if you look in how the Greeks would write Japheth in their Bibles, it would be Iapetus. Okay? So it's almost exactly Jupiter. It's just, and Jupiter is a Roman Thracian version, and that S at the end is something that the Greeks are going to do. It's Japheth S, and this is Jupiter, okay? And people are going to say it means Deus Pater. I don't buy that. I'm sorry. I realize Jew and Jew sound alike, but J-U-P-T is Japheth. Like, I'm sorry, that's Japheth, okay? So, and of course, he's going to be the high god of the Thracians, because the Thracians are the sons of, or the Trojans. The Trojans and the Romans are all going to have Jupiter, where the Greeks are going to have Zeus, okay? And they're two different gods. Zeus is based, and there is no guy called Zeus Pater, okay? This is what people have constructed into Proto-Indo-European as a speculation, that Jupiter must be the word for God and the word for Pater. So Father God, Zeus Pater, Jupiter, okay? But there is no god anywhere that's called Zeus Pater. So if that was the case, why don't we have a god in any of these Indo-European languages that's called Zeus Pater? We don't. Because he's not described as a father to them. He's described as a transcendent, ever-existing being, or a sky god like Baal. Okay? So Jupiter, that's just bad etymology. It's reasonable etymology, but it's like them saying like Jove is not Jehovah. It's like Jove, Jehovah. Like Jehovah's right there. Like Jove is Jehovah. No, because whatever they're going to do, they're just going to pretend the Hebrews don't exist. This is what your academic scholars do. No, the Hebrews just didn't exist. If anything, there were these tiny little people in the mountains. They barely existed. And it's like, okay, well, why are these people called the Haparu literally described in archaeological records absolutely everywhere that the Hebrews of the Bible were? And they're called Haparus. And literally, the name Haparu doesn't disappear until the name Arab pops up, and that starts being the generic term for these mixed people of the desert. Okay? Because the Arabs are what they start calling the Hebrews after Israel is the distinct nation. So Israel and Judah become the distinct kingdom of these people. They're not just these generic Hebrews anymore. They're a legitimate kingdom with lines of kings, and they're known by the Egyptians and they're known by the Assyrians because they're making treaties with them, and they're becoming allies with them, and they're also becoming subordinate to them. So these are a known people. These other people that were Hebrews, mostly, they just call them the mixed people, and that's what Arab means. Arab means to mix, okay? So the point is it's the difference between the tribals and the kingdom, which is what they have. Remember, they've kicked butts on all the kingdoms around them. So you have the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, you have the kingdom of Tyre, you have somewhat the Philistines, and then you have the kingdoms of Israel and Judah over here. But the rest of these people are just tent-dwelling camel jockeys, basically, okay? So, getting back to where we are, Noah and Japheth are going to die over here. But remember, we've got 350 years for Moses. We've got 500 years after the flood for Japheth. For Noah. I always get those two names mixed up. And you got 500 years for Japheth. So what are they doing? Noah is sending Japheth. Remember, Noah is getting all these metals for the building of the ark, right? He needs stuff. He needs pottery for putting stuff in. He needs metal for different fasteners and stuff like this, okay? So he knows where the metal's is coming from. And he seems to, before the flood, like after the flood, he seems to send the Japhethite sons toward where the metals are. He tells them. That's why they get to it so fast. And so you're going to have the sons of Tarshish, which are going to be the sons of one of the sons of Javan, where the Greeks come from. They're going to beeline over here for Spain and England. They have these people called Tartessos. Those are the sons of Tarshish. It seems to be like the Sicilians and the Sardinians are probably originally descended from them. So they're going to island hop over here through, they're probably going to go around here, and then they're going to go down into southern Italy, and then they're going to go up into here, and then they're going to go up into here, and then they're going to go up to England. And they're setting up a trade route for the tin that comes from England, and there's to lesser degrees in Spain. There's also silver and stuff coming from there. There's a little bit here in these mountains, but that's one substantial source. And we have proof that the tin from here eventually ends up in Haifa, which is Jewish-controlled Haifa, because the Danites are going to take that over, okay? And then he sends these other ones over here to to Afghanistan, which is where the tin mines are and the lapis lazuli mines are. So if you want to see the standard of Ur, the standard of Ur is this amazing artifact that tells us so much about the ancient world. This blue in here is lapis lazuli, okay? So I don't know what this other stuff is. It's probably like ivory or whatever. But anyways, this blue, remember, this thing is almost 5,000 years old. And it looks great because lapis lazuli is a stone that is blue and it holds up over time. You can see it if you look up close, how you have little broken pieces of it planted into this thing, okay? This is some amazing craftsmanship for that day, okay? They're taking different colored stones to create this motif, and they're carving them and, putting etching into them and darkening them and stuff like that. And then the background is lapis lazuli. That's what gives it its blue color, okay? So lapis lazuli is this famous stone, and you're going to have basically not the Atrahasis, but it's called and Merkur and the Lord of Arata epic, which is all about getting back the lapis lazuli to build this temple to one of the gods, because the supply chain is all broken down because of the Tower of Babel. And it's going to talk about how they all used to speak one language, and then Enki confused their tongues, okay? So lapis lazuli trade is a big deal for artistic things. Tin is a big deal because you need it to make bronze. And so I found this amazing map, which is this is basically the Indus Valley. This is where the Hamites were in the beginning. This is Magar. That was their original crafting capital of the Canaanites before the flood. So the Canaanites seem to found what is now called Elam before the flood, and they seem to found the Indus Valley. Basically, he's going to go east of Eden, and his people are essentially going to just migrate up and down this coast and start this civilization up here and have basically trade between that civilization and Elam. This is all Canaanite stuff, okay? And the Hamites are going to go back and retake us, with the exception of Elam. That's taken by the Semitic sons of Elam, who's a son of Shem, okay? Notice these orange lines here. These are basically routes where Bactrian camels and maybe mules and stuff like this are going to be carrying resources from here to here. Probably mostly metals and lapis lazuli and some other goods. They're probably not trading food back and forth because these guys got plenty of food. And then these guys are eventually going to take their farming techniques from down here in Sumer, and they're going to start to use some of them up here. And this is how you're going to have this Bactrian-Margiana complex. These are rivers that flow all the way up from the Hindu Kush up here. This is the Hindu Kush. And they flow down in the Indus, and this is where the Hamites are. But they also have some of them that flow towards the north. That's the Aral Sea. That's the Caspian Sea. And you see this Andronova Tazagayab culture and the Andronova culture. These cultures, which are the predecessors to the Germanic and Russian and Mongol and Turk cultures. Remember, these names are just named after a site, and that site can sometimes have a modern name on it. You want to be careful not to look for meaning in these names, okay? For instance, Harappa, where the Harappan civilization is named after, that's the more popular name now for the Indus Valley civilization, is because there's a modern village named Harappa near where they believe was the capital of it, so they just call the capital of it Harappa. Well, the people of Sumer call this Malulu. So that's what it was really called, was Malulu, okay? That's the only name of it we know that's ancient. Okay, but we call it the Indus Valley civilization because the Indus-Aryans, this is their word for river, so they just call it the river civilization. And then Harappa, because of the modern village, we call it the Harappan civilization. So when you deal with modern archaeological terms, you got to remember they're not great terms. The Oxus River is like literally a modern Russian name for the river. So this Oxus civilization, you don't want to look for any meaning in Oxus or the Bactria-Margiana complex, because Bactria is a name given it to by the Greeks when Alexander the Great takes over. So a lot of these names are literally thousands of years after the civilization was founded. So don't look for meaning in these Andronovo. They're going to call them like the Bell Beaker culture because they all have this cup that's like this, okay? And they're going to throw thousands of years in there. And you got to remember, when they're doing these thousands of years, it's not carbon dating that they're getting these thousands of years from. In some cases, there's carbon dating mixed with stuff having to do with sedimentary layers, which is just really bad science to make stuff seem much older than it is, okay? Anything having to do with sedimentary layers and I forget what it's called, the geological column, and stuff having to do with layers of ice. You don't know how many times that ice melted and froze over in a year. Oh, each one's a year. No, I'm sorry. I've lived in very cold climates, and I'm telling you, you could literally have the ice just melt because you have a nice sunny day finally when the clouds come over, and then it freezes back over, and then you've got a hard layer, and then a soft layer, and then a hard layer, and then a soft layer. Those are not different years. Those are like over and over and over again in the same year. So these are bad science, okay? But you have these rivers that flow towards the north, and generally speaking, these people are going to come from over here. Notice you see Assyria right here, you see Arapa right here. This is where the Ararat region is, and they're going to follow these rivers and these coastlines up to the BMAC. See how you have rivers here? These rivers between these two seas, they're flowing from these mountains into these two seas, the Black and Caspian. This is where the Sumerians are. These are going to be the sons of Gomer, who are the first to get horses. So Japheth is going to get the horses, and he's going to pass them down to his eldest Gomer, and that's going to be a big deal. So these guys are going to be the first people to introduce cavalry tactics about 1,000 years later as a massive warfare tactic. And then eventually, another 1,000 or 2 years later, you're going to have massive Turkish armies and Mongol armies who are all riding horses because horses are way more widespread. But in the beginning, it's mostly these guys that have them. It's a big deal. You're noble if you have a horse, because horses, you literally could be like, over the lifetime of one guy who lives to be up to hundreds of years old, he's going to have 20 horses over the course of his lifetime. So when you're talking about breeding horses, they don't breed super fast. It's not like you're going to have, oh, there's another litter of horses. No, they're going to be like, yeah, they had another horse. Who's going to get that? Well, obviously the prince is going to get that, and it's going to be the lines of the nobles that get these horses. And this is why you have this culture of people burying people with their horses all among these northern peoples, because it's a big deal to own a horse. You need munties to have a horse. So when the Egyptians start getting horses and breeding them, it's because they're getting them from the Hebrews, who are allied with these people and probably married in with them. And they start to be one of the more advanced cultures. And of course, these people all have in common that they want to see the Babylonian Amorites and the Hittites go down. So that's probably why they're giving them horses, just like Solomon's giving horses and chariots to the people around Assyria, because he doesn't want to see Assyria grow. Okay? So this BMAC complex, you see how these rivers are naturally, these rivers and these coastlines are going to naturally take you up here to this river system, which is right where the BMAC culture is. Okay? All they're doing is they're just going downhill to the east of the Ararat region, and they're finding their way to the coastline and up these coastlines and up these rivers. This is how all human migration is happening. You're not looking for a reason to just be like, hey, let's go use some witchcraft sticks to see if we can find water here. You're following the rivers and the seas. That's it. And so you have these rivers going down here up to the BMAC. There you go. And then they get up here and they realize, oh, there's these other rivers over here not that far away. And they've got, by this time, ox carts and horse carts, and they're breeding the Bactrian camel for transport, and then mules and stuff like this. Okay, and so they're getting up here and they're realizing there's these other cultures. And so what you're having these cultures spread up these rivers around these different river systems, while the main core of their culture is right here. So this BMAC complex is going to be the most dense population of Japhethites until the Tower of Babel. And so you see the lapis lazuli mines up here. The tin mines are somewhere around here. I don't know exactly where they are. I know they're in the Hindu Kush region. And so what you have here, notice these travel routes here, and some of them go right to Harappa. These routes, which would have been mules and camels and maybe later on horses, are going to take you to where the lapis lazuli and the tin comes from. This is right here. And both the Harappans, which are Hamites, and the BMACs, which are Japhethites, are going to share in that activity of mining this stuff, and also in trading it back to the rich peoples of Mesopotamia, because they have all the rich farmlands. Okay? They don't seem to be going to war with each other. They seem to be trading with each other. They're growing their distinctive civilizations. Remember, these Hamites right here are digging up. They're archaeologists. They're digging up the pre-flood stuff. These guys are building new stuff. They're going for the same resources from before the flood, but they're building new civilizations. They're not trying to uncover the old pagan Canaanite civilizations. The Hamites are. And they're going to follow this stuff, and it's mostly here because, remember, the Canaanites and all these people, most of this spread probably took place over, honestly, 500 years before the flood. So it's not super dense. It's not going all over the world. They're probably not in China. They might be some distant colonies in China. There are definitely pre-flood colonies in the Americas, but that was probably before the split that became the Atlantic Ocean happened with the flood. Those lands were probably connected. But you have this center of trade. You see the intersection of there, and this makes sense. This is where their main civilization is, where they craft stuff. This is where they're getting the raw materials from. This is them transporting trade to the Harappans, because the Harappans are probably going to have access to all these Indian spices and stuff. And then this is where they're going to flow it back towards Elam. So notice you have a route from where the materials are coming from back to this city towards Elam, and then this is going to be a city that grows. You're going to see a couple of big complexes here. Notice this is where this river ends. So they're basically following this river system. But they're taking this lowland route because they know where the river is by this time. And then you have a connection back to the core of the BMAC civilization, the cities over here, down to where this route goes towards Elam. So they're trading with Elam, and then they're trading with probably Assyria and Akkad, probably. And then these routes are just, these cities are going to form at the intersection just like they do today. So the city where I'm from is Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's literally formed on the basis of the main route going up towards the UP, connecting with the main route going from Chicago over to, this is Grand Rapids and Kalamazoo, over to Detroit and Lansing. And so because you have these roads that are crossing right here, cities and stuff naturally tend to form where those roads are. Well, back in the day, that was camel routes and rivers. So they've got the Bactrian camel coming from over here, and they're trading all down here, and you also got mules and stuff, pack animals, and then they've got these two main routes. Over here is going to be where the Gutians come from, which are going to overthrow Akkad, and the Elamites are going to be the ones, the Semites, that are always getting oppressed by these guys and overthrowing them. And the Elamites never do great. They're never a strong independent kingdom. They break away every now and again, and then they keep going back into subjugation to the Sumerians or the Akkadians or the Babylonians or the Assyrians or the Persians. They just don't do great, but they eventually become the capital of Persia. And this city of Susa seems to have been established probably by Canaanites back in the day. So these are the people we're going to talk about today, because it's out of this culture that Zoroaster seems to, or the, I believe, myth. I don't believe Zoroaster. He may have been based on a real guy, but he seems to be based on Ziusudra. Zarathustra is what they call him, and Zarathustra means golden camel. Ziusudra in Japhethite would mean God of the flood. Okay? Which makes a lot of sense if you have a guy who's based on Noah and he means in Japhethite God of the flood. But your scientists don't believe that because, well, the Japhethites weren't down here in Sumer, and that's where Ziusudra emerges. But if you tease the data and get rid of the stupid Sumerians kings list, you're like, okay, was that before or after the Gutians came and took over? They're like, after. Okay. Well, the Gutians are from these guys over here, which means they speak a Japhethite language, which means if they've got terms for God of the flood, which they do, and by the way, this is before the Tower of Babel, it makes sense that after that they're still calling him by the name that the Japhethites called him, God of the flood. Okay? So this would have been after Noah's dead, after Japheth is dead. No, I'm sorry. They come in while Japheth is still alive, and Zeus means actually, I think it actually means more like heavens or heavenly, and then, but it seems to be their version of a term for people who have been exalted and taken up to heaven, which Noah has by that time. So, so just like these other people have these people who become the stars, they have people who go up in heaven when they die. Okay, so the idea of ascending and ascending masters. This is going to be a very Japhethite term. Okay, these people who go up into heaven and become one with God or something like this. This is going to be in all the religions. So you have this guy down here, Ziusudra, who emerges. And because I'm correcting the Sumerians' kings list, I'm going to place this somewhere around within a century of the Tower of Babel. That's how long this is. And these Gutians are going to rule basically until the Amorites come and take over. And it seems like they just leave on their own. We don't have evidence of a war between the Amorites and the Gutians. We do have Sumerians talking about overthrowing the Gutians, so maybe like they were overlording over them, and then they started to leave as Akkad started to fizzle, and their culture was subdued by the Amorites, and then the Amorites are going to come and take over the turf, and because the Amorites are related to the Sumerians, the Zemarites and the Sinites, they get uppity when the Amorites start coming in, and they start pushing out the Gutians. That seems correct, okay? I have a feeling, because we can't find a trace of a people, where are these Gutians? Oh, they came from these mountains. They're just these barbarians. That's what they called them, okay? Okay, well, if this civilization of people was big enough and powerful enough to overthrow Naram-Sin's kingdom, that's a big deal, within like a decade of Naram-Sin's life, or it might be like 20 years later. That's a big deal. These were not a small people, but you can't tell me where they came from and who they are? Well, I have a feeling because the Gathas are the original songs of Zoroaster are called the Gathas. Now, what does Gathas mean? I don't know. I have a feeling, I think it just means something like recite, okay? That the Japhethites did not have a written language until after the Tower of Babel. And so the Japhethites, in order to remember their history, they were in the habit of reciting things through song, which these tendencies you actually find following other Japhethites culture. You're going to find all kinds of Indo-Aryan people who are known for singing songs to recite their religion and history and culture. The Indo-Aryans do it. You're going to find when you hear about these Vikings who are singing their songs as they're rowing along, they're not just doing this to keep rhythm. This is their version of writing, okay? Recite through song. So Gatha seems to mean something like recite through song, and it wouldn't shock me if Guti is rooted in the Sumerians saying these are the people who sing or recite. And that Guti is a generic term for the people of the Gathas. Because when they finally do get a writing system, the first thing they write down is the stuff about Zarathustra and the Gathas. They also mention this guy Yima, who is another Noahic figure, and it seems like they're getting to Zeosudra and Yima are two different Noahic figures. And Yima is the guy who supposedly is supposed to save a bunch of people, the best of the breeds of the animals and the peoples from a massive ice age, which, since these guys are basically held from migrating north by an ice age, it seems like for a time, it makes sense that these are pretty much the only culture of people who have an ice age instead of a flood. Okay? So, they're going to get ideas that come from the Sumerians, and it's really obvious that they do. They really seem to look up to this bull god, the Avestans, which is the Avestans are the culture of the Medes over here. But remember, the Medes are on this trade route right here. So what becomes the Medes and the Persians are probably all related to Turkish peoples and Median peoples. They're going to spread along these trade routes, and that's why you see that's all their cities. And then these tribes are going to grow along these trade routes, and of course they're going to have their different animals that they breed, and then their herds and their flocks, and they're going to graze, and they're going to move, and stuff like that, and then they're eventually going to establish cities and towns too. But the main place they trade to, if you see there's Ashur right there. Let's get to this bigger version of this map. This is an amazing map, by the way. This is the whole picture of this map, and I found this website. It's Tabula Geographica. It's a German website that's putting this together. See how you got Mizra and Miser and Kemet? Those are the two names for Egypt. Kemet is based on Ham. Mizra is based on Mizraim. Cush, right there. It's showing your sea trade routes. They're getting the archaeological evidence and they're pulling it together. So there's your sea trade between the Indus and there. Why don't we have a lot of sea trade going all the way around? Well, probably because once upon a time you had river systems that went down here, and they went along those river systems. They probably trade mostly by camel, but this map, I believe right here, is dated to 1200 BCE, which is around the time that the Danites are taking over all this stuff. And notice how you have these sea trade routes. There's Ugarit. The Danites are going to overthrow that. That's the sea peoples. They're going to go down through Egypt. Some of these sea trade routes were established by the Jews while they were still friendly with the Egyptians. They're going to go up in here and take over all this, and they're going to start getting up into here. And there's Walusa or Troy. The Danites are going to get up into here, and there's Darduna. And they are going to seem to get up here with the Thracians and stuff. You have these people called the Dardanim, which are probably Danites from Darduna. You have the Tuatha De Danann, who are going to come to Ireland, which is just literally means tribe of Dan, the day word. To the Celts, who come in later. This is going to be like hundreds of years later, almost 1,000 years later. These Celts, the day is their word for God, so they're going to think Tuatha De Danann means tribe of the goddess Dana. Or Dana. Okay, well, why? Well, because Dana is supposedly the mother of Perseus, and it's just a generic word for a female Danite. Danae. Okay? And then you have these women called the Danans, who are associated with a legend of all the Egyptian princes dying under Hercules. You have these legends with the Danites and the Hercules all the time, because Hercules is Samson, and Hera is she who became pregnant. So we're going to get into this poem where they call Asherah, or they call Ishtar, Ishara, which literally is the Semitic for woman. The woman became pregnant, and they have this. They change Ishtar's name to Ishara, which is closer to Asherah, every time someone gives birth. And they say for 9 days they're going to call Ishtar Ishara, which literally means the woman or the wife became pregnant. Ish-Hera. It's the exact word. So Hera is she who became pregnant. That's Samson's mom. And she's going to travel around. And you're going to have Perseus, which means from Zeus, and Danae, because Samson's mom's the Danae. And that's just another version of Samson. And these are going to travel around with the Celts, who are up here. They're coming from like the Czechoslovakia region. They seem to be some Mongol people who kidnapped or traded for some Thracian wives, and they end up with these red-haired peoples and with blue eyes, and they're going to travel around. They're going to become the Celts, the Galatians, the Gauls, the people who become the Irish, the Britons, the Scots. All of these people are going to come from the Celts, and they're going to get down to the Iberian Peninsulas, and they're going to take over these lands that were once occupied by Tarshish, and the Tarshish people are still there. They're called Tartessos, and they're going to start to mix their linguistics. But the people of Tarshish seem to be these people over here who also mix in with the people from Troy. So they're going to be called the Tyrrhenians to the Greeks, but Etruscans to the Latins. So the Etruscans they're basically Thracians, but they're they're like the more civilized Thracians versus the more redneck Thracians are the Trojans, and then they become the Etruscans, and then they start Rome with people from Tarshish, people from Greece, and people from Troy. That's basically what Rome seems to be based on. Tribes of people who came from them. There's also these people called the Samnites who are among them, which would not shock me if they're descendants of Samson. Because the Danites are all up in here, and the Samnites are right here. So you have all these people coming together to form Rome, and Rome is the ones who use the day for the word of. Okay? And that's where the Spanish get it. That's where the Italians get it. Yada, yada. Okay? Well, where did they get it from? Well, they don't get it from the Greeks, because the Greeks don't do that. Okay? Well, they either get it from the people of Tarshish or the people from Troy. Well, we have the Trojan language from when they were probably mixing with the Hittite or the Luwian language, which is basically based on the Lydians, and it's a Creole of Japhethite, Hittite, and Lydian. We don't have evidence of the day coming from Troy. So if it's not coming from the Greeks and it's not coming from the Trojans, all that's left is the people of Tarshish. And we don't have any evidence of their language except when it was Romanized later on. So which means that the people were here when the Danites got here. If they're from Tarshish, they're probably using the word day to mean of. And so Tuatha De Danann Tuatha means the Celtic word for tribe or people. De means just of, and Danann is the Danites. And the Danans are the same people who founded the Tuatha De Danann, they say in their legends, came from 4 great cities. The Danites established 4 great cities, and those cities are going to be Thebes, up here in Thebal, I think, Thebai, that's Thebes. Gnosis, so you see Canusa. Gnosis is going to be established by them. Mycenae, so you see Makanu, that's Mycenae. And then, what's the fourth one? Argos. So Jason and the Argonauts and the people who went for the Golden Fleece, that was established by Danans too. And they established it, and they had trade routes that went right into Avaris. They had a canal from Avaris right to the Red Sea when the Danites were friendly with the Egyptians. So all this Egyptian sea trade that ends up with the Egyptians controlling Cyprus and Crete through, they called it Keft. Keft are the Copts and the people who the Egyptians were allies with down here. You find Thebes in Egypt, which is where the Egyptians who are allies with the Jews had their capital. They moved their capital from Memphis up here down to Thebes down here, and right next to Thebes is a city called Kift. Kaft. It's the Coptics. Okay, so those are the Egyptians that the Jews allied with, and that's the main Egyptian language today. Because under Joseph, he disperses all the other tribes of the 7 Egyptians to the 4 corners of Egypt, and the main language of the ruling class for a century and a half is the Coptics. And so that's the unified language of the Egyptians, and that's how Coptic becomes the main language, because the people of Kaftor, the Coptics, are going to be the ruling class of the Egyptians alongside the Hebrews. Very simple stuff when you just you learn your history, okay? So most of these trade routes you see here are probably established by Danites in the first place, not by Egyptians. Probably in conjunction with the Egyptians, and so when the Hebrews go into slavery, the Egyptians take a lot of these trade routes over, but a lot of them just die after that, okay? And so when it's a mirror, you have to understand the amount of time that they're in captivity is about 100 to 120 years. It's not a long time. Their entire time in Egypt is about 240 years. So no, I'm sorry, it's about a century. So they got 150 years free where they establish all these trade routes. And then they've got 100 years in captivity where they're not able to access these trade routes. And so what do they do when they divide the land of Israel up? The Danites get the land where the port of Joppa is. And why do the Danites have this tiny little land when they have the second largest army next to Judah? Probably because the intention was for the Judahites and the Danites to overthrow all the Philistines right off the bat, take their ports, and then the Danites were going to go reestablish all the trade routes that they had back in the day. But they didn't do that because they were scared of the Philistines. They wouldn't persist in what God told them to do. Hence, we have the book of Judges, which ends up with the Danites sailing away in boats after they take out Ugarit and these Canaanite cities up here from Dan, ally with the people of Tyre, and then they just leave the Philistines alone. And so what do we have? Samson going out and then coming back, and he lands at Gaza. He goes out and has his Herculean adventures over here, and he comes back 20 years later, and he's in Gaza ripping off their gates, even though he started 5 cities north. So he's over by closer to Ekron when he's fighting the Philistines before he leaves. When he gets back, he's in Gaza sleeping with a prostitute. Why? He's been sailing the Red Seas, and the Peliset are among the people who are in the Sea Peoples now sailing with him. So they're all just raiding and pillaging all over the place because they're all getting thrown off the island of Crete by Samson and the Danites. And their trade routes are getting overthrown from here to here, and so you have the Shekelesh, the Sicilians, and the Sardana or whatever, the Sardinians, are also part of these raiding and pillaging, because what are they trying to do? They're trying to fight back and figure out who's taken out their trade routes and try to fight back, and all they know is that these people seem to come from Egypt, and so they're raiding Egypt. They're trying to get back at the Danites because the Danites did originally establish this stuff from Egypt, and they end up attacking Egypt, and Pharaoh Ramses beats them up. And there are Danites among them, Denyon and probably Asherites too, because the Asherites surrounded the Danites. They're mentioned also as in their breaches, which basically means they're places where their ships are tucked away. So, back to the Aksu civilization. This is the whole ancient Near East. This is their trade routes. When we get back to the Aksu civilization, where you see BMAC, that's the Aksu civilization. I believe this is the Oxus River right here. And this whole area is the Aksu civilization. So the BMAC's right in the middle. All these cities where you see. Notice you see Shortu guy. There were these short guys that were Chinese. I know the name kind of sounds short. Chinese for short guy. He probably is Chinese for short guy. I'm not going to lie. It makes a lot of sense. The Chinese seem to have... So what you're going to have here, remember, you're going to have Sargon of Akkad. You're going to have, at first, a peaceful settlement of Sinites and Sumerians right here. They're not trying to take over anyone by conquest. When you see records of wars and stuff like this in this region, it's because they're pre-flood wars. After the flood, they're peaceful. They're pretty much peaceful until Noah dies. Nobody's going to try to make war while Noah's alive, and he can call Shem and Japheth and be like, put that down. There ain't no way nobody's going to try to start a war when Noah dies. And so you don't have any real wars from the time of Noah until the time of Nimrod. Well, what's going to happen with Nimrod? Well, Nimrod they're digging up these archaeological records in these priesthood, and they had these records from these wars before, and he's going to start wars in vengeance for stuff that happened before the flood. And to erase the falsehood and the propaganda of what he's doing, he's going to push the flood backwards to say, oh, the flood was thousands of years ago. You guys overthrew this city, and we're getting revenge on you. He's changing the calendar to basically act like he is righting the wrongs of stuff that happened before the flood by pushing the flood backwards, and he's doing this almost immediately after, like within 20 years of Noah dying. He knows not only is Noah dead, there's very few people still alive that live because Shem and Japheth are still alive, but most of their sons are dead, and their grandsons and their great-grandsons are dead of old age, because people's ages drop from 600 to 400 to 250 within a few generations. And so if Noah's dying in 350 years after the flood, well, by 400 years after the flood, you're going to have almost everybody else dead with the exception of Shem and Japheth. And so Shem and Japheth are these really old guys who few loyal people they revere them. But what they don't have is sons and sons and sons that can rally their people really quick to do what they want. They have to build consensus to do this, because what they have is their great-great-grandchildren who are still faithful and still revering them because they know who they are. And so it's going to take some time. And so it takes roughly a century for Shem and Japheth to rally up the overthrow of these guys. And that seems to be rallied from, again, I believe Japheth is over here because you find evidence of high craftsmanship over here. I'm going to show you this. This is the artwork that comes out of here. What the Japhethites that were doing that was really unique is they are actually making stuff with multiple metals together. When everybody else is just trying, just trying to figure out bronze again to make weapons, they're like, we're making this, what does it say it is? An eagle-head demon with animals from their area. I do not see what it's made out of, but you can tell there's gold and other metals in here, okay? So you have this lion with wings, this two-headed eagle, which ironically is the Russian symbol on their ancient flag, and then this boar, which seems like a regular boar. Doesn't seem like an angel or anything. So he's got angel's wings, he's got angel wings. There seems to be, this god seems to be mediating a dispute between them. And this symbol of a god pushing back two other beasts does not seem to be depicting how strong he is. It seems that's part of it, but what it is that he is forcing these other beings to make peace, because he is interceding for them because he's stronger than both of them. That seems to be what that signifies. Guy with the eagle head, Horus had an eagle head. The fact that he has two heads could just be signifying that he's talking to both of them. It could not necessarily have to be a two-headed being. Could just be like he's looking both ways, and that's how they signify it. But the point is, you have animals, and then you have an angelic realm. Okay, so what's going on here? I don't know, but it's depicting some kind of angelic being, it seems, who is interceding between an animal and another type of cherubim or something like that. Okay. Does this necessarily have to be idolatry? Not necessarily. It could literally be them depicting things that they're believing going on in the spiritual realm in art, or just telling stories. It doesn't necessarily have to be idolatry. They don't necessarily have to worship this god. See, this is the mistake that a lot of your archaeologists are going to make. They find a depiction of any guy who seems to have some prominence and they assume he's a god. Well, why does it have to be a god? Why couldn't it just be their common ancestor or something they believe about some angel or something like that? Why does it have to be a god? It's like the Jews who believe the angel stirred the water in the thing. Doesn't mean they worship that angel, but they believe that thing about him, right? So we don't want to assume that that's a god, but we do have evidence that the Sinites probably came in a mix among them, and they brought in false religion, okay? When we're reading the Gathas, and I've read all there's 5 of them, the original Gathas, it's clear that Zarathustra is trying to reform the faith back from the corruption of these other priests. Well, if you look at what happens here, here's your genetic map again, and here is your trade routes again. When Sargon comes in and he overthrows these cities here, well, these cities had nobles and kings that he overthrew. Well, some of them he might subjugate to himself and take them to prison or whatever. Some of them he might kill. But you're going to have nobles, which are basically family members who are related to these guys, who he's going to kick out of power, except for the ones who are willing to suck up to him and betray their family and rule underneath him. So he's going to exalt puppet curs, who are people who are like, that red-haired guy on the Emperor Snoke is talking about, and he's like, he's a cur, but sometimes a cur can be useful. They're these suck-up losers, but they get to rule because they're going to do what you tell them, because they're like Trump sycophants, okay? And the real nobles are like, okay, we're peacing out. And so they have access to these trade routes up through here in the Indus, and also over here, because these are the nobles who were trading with these people in a just way, in a fair way. They had trade agreements with them. You bring us lapis lazuli and tin from here, and we will give you all this food, all the food you can carry, or whatever, our pottery and stuff like that, okay? So the trade that goes on between these guys is maintained, and what's going to happen is that these relationships are going to migrate out towards where their trade routes are. And so you're going to have these Sinites and Zemarites early on are going to migrate out up the Indus and up into the BMAC civilization. Now let's compare that with our genetic map. You have these people over here, and look at, they're going up here. Notice where they are. They're coming from over here. You're going to have these Putites who are the sailing people, so they're going to be up here. But then you're going to have these El peoples, which are going to be over here in Arabia up in here. And then you're going to have, notice this brown line. Who's this brown line? The brown line seems to be maybe DE. You see D. And whoever these are, notice you're going to see some of them going down here in the south along the coastlands to India. Some of them are going to go up here. You're also going to have these 2 peoples, C and Q. The same 2 peoples, C and Q, that you're going to find all the way over here. Notice you're going to have C. They're going to go down into Australia. They're going to go up around the coastlines all the way into Americas, the C people. Also, the Q people are going to go all the way over into Americas, but they're not going to go along the coastlines. They're going to come up here, right into the heart of the BMAC civilization, and some of them are going to mix with the Turkmen. Others are going to mix with the Mongols, and out of these Mongoloid peoples, they're going to come here, and they're going to become North American Indians, and it looks like Mesoamerican Indians. So which were first between the C and the Q? I expect that the Q were first. I expect the Q were first because they would have been able to migrate over massive land bridges as these ice shelves were receding, and as soon as those ice shelves were receding, you still had quite a bit of land because there were still thick ice shelves here, and they would have just been able to land migrate over here. because these are the original peoples who are getting run out of Sumer and Akkad. And those people are going to come over here, and I expect that those are the Q peoples, and they're short, stumpy people, like the Sumerians probably were. And I expect that the Sumerians, the short, stumpy Sumerians, also mixed with Puntites and Cushites and became the Pygmies over here. If you look at the reliefs we have of them, and these are probably pre-flood stuff, you see people who are wearing these grass skirts. Let's see if I can find them. They're wearing these grass skirts that come up to over their bellies, but they don't wear anything on the tops. That's how the Pygmies dress too. So these guys probably adopted the dress of the pre-flood people with these big grass skirts and stuff, probably made of fig leaves, like Adam and Eve wore fig leaves. And you have the Indians worshiping this fig tree, or having a cult based around this fig tree. So it's probably based on the fig leaves Adam and Eve wore. But those people seem to become the Pygmies. Again, you probably had them bringing some Sumerians to help them over here establish a civilization, and they were trading peacefully until the Tower of Babel. And then you got like 3 different languages pop up, and they isolate themselves as the Khoisan peoples, the Pygmy languages, the Bantu, and then the Cushites are going to mix with all of them. So you see the E over here from the Cushites are mixed with everyone because they're the predominant tribe of the Africans. Where these other people, these Pygmies and these Khoisans and these Nilotic peoples, are probably mixed with Cushites. You see E2 here, but the A's are probably, I'm just taking a wild stab at this, they are probably the original languages of Punt, or based in that. And then the Bantu is probably a mixture of them with Cushites here, where these are probably more isolated. They also could be people who are descended from the Sumerians, and that's why their language is so different. And then the Pygmies seem to be people who are more Cushite-Sumerian mix, but I think their languages are closer to the Bantu. So, again, these are pretty wild guesses. I'm not going to try to over-specify like how specific I think this is, but essentially I believe the mixture of Africa is Sumerian, Cushite, and Puntite. For the most part, Egyptian up here, but they're going to be overrun by the Semites. So you don't have a lot of raw Egyptian genes anymore, except the Copts, but they're mixed. And then the Berbers are going to be, combinations of people that are probably related to the Sidonians and also the Cushites and the Puntites. So they're mixed, but you see major threads here that seem to be Cushites, Puntites, and then another people. Who is that other people that become the Khoisan? I think the language might be Sumerian or closer to Sumerian. That would be my guess, because it has some sounds in it that are awful close to these LTL sounds, which make kind of a clicking sound, that are going to be down in here. And I think those are the people who come afterwards. Again, you're going to see the C. Notice you have a CF right here. So the F is probably going to be Cushites who are along here. So CF is probably going to be a combination. Notice it's coming out of here. CF is probably this combination of Sumerians and Cushites. And then they're up in here, which makes sense. That's where Sumer is, and that's where Sargon is, who, if he's Nimrod, he's descended from Cush. That makes sense. And then they're going to migrate over here. As you see C and F. They're probably going to split. You see the light blue right here is F. And then somewhere along the line, these K people pop up. And these, when you see these new letters pop up, it starts with A and goes down to B. It's because there's another mixture of people that come into the line, and then that stays prominent after that. And so whoever these people are, you're going to see the K people and the O people, and all these O people seem to become the Chinese, but they're not all that become the Chinese, because you see C and D, you see D right here, Tibeto-Burman. These are probably Sinites from the Shang dynasty, because the Shang dynasty seems to come in and then get pushed out by the Zhou dynasty, I believe, hundreds of years later. But from the time of the Tower of Babel to the time of the Zhou dynasty, they're the dominant one, and then they're going to be taken over by the Hans around 200 BC. So you see these O3 people, these Sino-Tibetan peoples here, they're all related. But these are probably the Shang that are closer to the Canaanites that came with their child sacrifice and stuff, or human sacrifice and all that. And we're going to get into where that comes from. and they maintain it long after the Chinese ban it, which suggests that those are the remnants of the Shang dynasty who brought it in that become the Tibetans. And it becomes the Bon cult, and these people claim that they're descended from monkey men, which is the exact same thing that these people claim, that there were these monkey men after the flood that were basically seemed to be their version of the Nephilim. So something that is kept here is also over here. Well, what's common between these places? Well, we see the D and the O, but what we see in both places is, notice you see N popping up here and you see Q up here. This Q seems to come through here. N's kind of a mystery to me. I'm not going to try to figure it out, but this C goes all along the Chinese coast. Notice it's all up here in the Mongols too, and all the way down into here. So these seem to be Sinites from after the Tower of Babel. So there's Sinites before the Tower of Babel that are probably Q, and Sinites and Zemarites from after the Tower of Babel, those are probably C, or vice versa. Those are the main two peoples. And so they're coming and they're going to where their relatives are. That makes sense that that's what you're going to do if the languages are all confused. You're going to go to where you know you're related to people and hope that they speak the same language. And so they go, notice you have C up here and Q over here. They beeline to right where they are. Well, C probably was, I honestly don't know which one is earlier. I suspect it's Q because that seems to be primarily land, or I'm sorry, C seems to be, well, land and sea, and Q seems to be mostly land. So probably Q is first, and then the C, the C people come by C later on. But these C people go to Austro-Aborigines. You have O people, which are actually descended from the Chinese, but that doesn't necessarily have to be ancient because the Chinese actually had a big navy that actually colonized the Americas and all the way over here way, way, way back in the day. So that could be much later genetics, but the E3A is probably, notice that's Kushite. So you're going to have Kushite peoples that are in Madagascar. They're going to be related to peoples who, you see E over here, that make it into probably India. And then you're going to see mostly O's and C's here, and M is going to be an isolated people. I'm not really sure who these are. M and S over here, these seem to be the people who become like the Samoans and stuff like that. And the Maori. That's New Zealand down there. So the Hakka people, like the rock. While you have these N people that come up through here, through China somehow, who are they? They're probably another Sinitic tribe, and they go up here and they become Ugric, Turkic, and Finnish peoples way up in the north. Well, who are these people that are way up in the north? Well, they're probably related to these people way up in the north. Notice you have the N's, the C's, and the Q's coming over here. And so they're probably a mixture of Sinitic and Mongoloid peoples too. See the C right here. And then there's N3 over here, N, N1. You see N, N1, N2, N3. So there's a mixture of people who have Chinese and Mongoloid descent. And so you're seeing these people isolate themselves because they're going north with these Mongoloid tribes. But again, these could literally just be women that these Mongols are taking with them, but they have the genetic strain from the Sinites, okay? And so these people are also going to keep re-spreading here with the Scythians, with the Mongols, the Huns, all these people over the centuries. So don't think this is like all what happened right after the Tower of Babel. But the main things, when you see these O people and these D people and stuff like this, are representing probably Canaanite and Sinite migrations from here as Sargon's overthrowing them. Then Sargon's people get overthrown and the Kassites go up here into the mountains. And then you probably have the Tower of Babel, which is a second dispersion of Canaanite and Sinite peoples. So the point is you have two dispersions. One at Sargon's takeover, which is going to be 1800s, 1900s BCE. And then one at the Tower of Babel, which is going to be 1700s to 1600s BCE. And around 1600 BCE is when the Chinese Shang civilization shows up here. It's also when the Olmec civilization starts over here. And I expect that those are Sinites and Zemarites that moved after the Tower of Babel. And again, it's not rocket science to figure out if they've got sea routes down here and they've got trade routes down here, that's going to be where they're going to migrate. They're going to migrate along existing roads with people that they were not at war with, they had peaceful trade relationships with. But they're going to get to these peoples, and it's not going to be a great place for them to settle because they're going to be an extreme minority because they don't speak the language. They have to learn the language. And we're going to see that reflected in their epics and stuff like that. So before we get into those epics, we're going to talk about the crafting skill of these guys. So one is, we know it's very cold where they're living. Again, you still have ice shelves to the north of them because all of their pictures of women, all their carvings of women, wear these huge, fat dresses. Who knows if they're made of wool or feathers or whatever, but they're huge, poofy dresses. And they're saying, well, this is the princesses and stuff. So their women were very covered. They were wearing what seemed to be thick furs or whatever, overlaid with this material that goes over the top. And all of their women are dressed like this. So the idea of this is it's probably very cold, and this was the style, to dress in big poofy dresses. So when you see later on in the European cultures where people are wearing these big poofy dresses, now they have the skinny top with the, suck the wind out of you and tie you down fashion. They still have the big, wide, hooped dress. Why? Because it goes back to these ancient people who wore these big, huge garments. And they probably did have hoops in them. And the reason is because what it is doing is trapping a large amount of heat around you while allowing you to walk freely. Makes a lot more sense than having a tight dress that's, you're very fully clothed, but you can barely walk because you're like an Eskimo. You're bound up too tight. If you had a big hoop in it, you could walk pretty freely, but it's trapping all that warm air around you so that you stay warm in the winter. And that's probably how the wealthy nobles got around. So we see a lot of women like this, big poofy dresses. And then we see art. This is like an eagle-headed god with snakes around him. What is the eagle-headed god with snakes around him? Well, I expect that, remember, they're trading with the Harappans. And the god who becomes Vishnu used to be called Hari, which is the same name that Horus used to be called in Egypt. And you have an eagle-headed guy holding snakes. I believe that Horus and Vishnu are probably based on Enoch. Possibly with attributes. Vishnu definitely has attributes of the Holy Spirit mixed in. So you see him fighting the two snakes here. He seems to be a good god versus the serpent as a bad god. And this could be Enoch, based on an Enoch or a Horus, that is interceding between cherubims and animals, maybe? I don't know. But the point is, this eagle-headed god seems to be imported from the Sinites or the Kushites from the Harappan civilization that they're traded from. That would be my guess. It's probably based on the same guy. Why does he have an eagle head? Because he's associated with a hawk and flying away and being raptured. That would be my thought. And he is also, if you understand like the legends of Enoch that seem to be all around in the ages after this. Now this is way older than that. So it says late 3rd millennium, early 2nd millennium BC. So this is after the time that they would have been digging up Egypt, probably before the time that Noah dies. They have these carvings depicting these things. What's going on? It's probably items from storytelling. Remember, the Sinites are traveling, and their stories are traveling with these merchants, and they're all keeping the same language. The Sinites start out next to Egypt. They then move over into Sumer and Akkad. They then move over to Oxus, and then they then move over into China. So these people are bringing stories with them, and that's why you have Re and Chi in China and Ra and Ka in Egypt. They're imports from Egypt. And a lot of stuff seems to be imported from Egypt. The whole Ouroboros snake thing and the cosmic egg and all this stuff all seem to come from Egypt. Also, they have, this is, again, same period, ballpark in the area where Japheth is possibly still alive. They're making carvings of the Bactrian camel, which seems significant. What is his name? Zoroastrianism. He's kind of like the OG Muhammad. Zarathustra's name means golden camel, probably because they're naming him, the Japhethites and the Canaanites, remember they're both kind of crafty, tend to name family names after their trade. So that's why you see the Germanic peoples doing that now. But this is probably something that starts with the Canaanites because they get into a division of labor faster and trade specialization faster because they suck at farming because of Cain's curse. And then you're going to have the Japhethites, because Noah's more crafty and Japheth is more crafty, they're going to do the same thing. They're going to start naming people after their trade crafts. So where you see Nin, lord of or master of the plow, it's the guy who invented the plow. Well, his name means golden camel. Guess what his family's probably known for? Probably breeding golden camels. They probably have great, their camels are the best camels. Okay? So it's probably a noble family who just breed camels, and they give him the name based on Ziusudra because they're trying to tie them together. But he's going to rebuke Yima, who is based on Noah, for allowing the people to eat meat. That's why you have in Sikhism and some parts of Buddhism and Hinduism people who don't eat meat, and that's why they revere the cow and won't eat the cow. Because they're getting influences from the Sinites about the bull of heaven, and they also are probably influenced by these Sinites and Cushites who are doing all this sacrificing of animals because they're reading entrails and stuff like this. So they're eating a lot more meat. They're also sacrificing a lot more meat, and that is not good for these people's livelihood who are living in harmony with their herds and stuff like that and growing them and using them for clothing. And yes, they are eating them on occasion, but they're not eating them on the regulars. It's just bad for business. You want to multiply these things. So the Bactrian camel is clearly something early on, seems to be associated with Zarathustra, seems to be associated with trade in that region. And it makes sense that if you have a family like that, sounds like Ziusudra, these families are breeding golden camels, that this religion can get adopted among that nobility. But I suspect that it would have popped up after the Tower of Babel, developed over centuries, and there's a lot of evidence of it developing over centuries and bringing in gods like Mithra and Indra and stuff like that over time. So don't think of Zoroastrianism, even though they call it like the world's oldest monotheistic religion. It's not, okay? It is basically monotheistic. It has the idea of Ahura Mazda as a transcendent god, and then two gods that basically represent Satan and the Holy Spirit that are twins, and they emerge from the primordial beginnings after him. Okay, so it is the idea of one original transcendent God, but it's corrupting the Trinity because it's putting the Holy Spirit on equal footing with Satan, essentially. They're called Angraminyu and Spentaminyu. So Holy Spirit and Angry Spirit, or Destructive Spirit is what you would call Angraminyu. So again, we have evidence of, look at these different kinds of stone. This is chlorite, calcite, gold, and iron all mixed together. So they're making stuff out of iron. They're crafting out of iron and gold and chlorite and calcite, stones and minerals. This is a horse head. Look at the detail on this thing. Second, this is 5,000 years old. Look how good they were at artisanship. Okay, again, these are the Japhethites. This is the Bactrian princess type. Again, we see lots of these. This is a electrum cup or something. Now, electrum is a mixture of gold and silver. The Egyptians would use this centuries later, many, many centuries later. It seems to start with the Japhethites. They seem to be doing stuff with alloys and mixing metals and putting things together. This is just as a handled weight. So this is probably just like a standard weight used for measuring stuff for trade. But look how ornate it is. Look how much is carved into it. More. But again, these women, look at their features. Look at their very Caucasian features, fine nose, fine lips. I mean, they look like they could be a Russian. 2,500 to 1,500, somewhere in there. So in the ballpark of the time between the flood, it's not 2,500, but between the flood and Tower of Babel, basically, shortly after the Tower of Babel. This is where this is. Chlorite is what that's made. Limestone in the head. So they're putting multiple kinds of stone together to make these things. How are they fitting these pieces together and keeping them to stay together? That's amazing craftsmanship. But they're doing it so they can get the different colors, and then look how fine these features are. This is 4,000-year-old stuff. So it's clear that if you look at the stuff in the Harappan civilization and then Sumer and stuff like this, it's like they're more advanced in writing and agriculture for sure, but in craftsmanship, there's nothing that's compared to the Japhethites. And this is all, when people talk about guns, germs, and steel and how it's all happenstance and accident, no, it's not. Noah intended for the Japhethites to expand and dominate the others. He intended for Shem to be the dominant religious people, the Japhethites to be the dominant political people, and the Hamites, who were rebellious and getting into the antediluvian crap, to be subdued. So you guys can say, well, that's racism based on the Bible. No, it's not racism based on the Bible. It's cause and effect based on bad behavior. This is why the Canaanites get wiped out. God's not just racist. They're sacrificing their children, and they're teaching others to do it. This is why God's like, these people need to go. Okay? So you see all their little metal fittings, their nails, their rings, their different little stuff. They're doing stuff that is just more advanced. The rest of these people are mostly on ceramics. They've got bronze weapons. They've got bows and arrows. But when it comes to metalwork, they're mostly on ceramic, where these guys are carving and probably stamp pressing. Because look at these bowls. How do you do that? You're some kind of stamp press. You're doing this with these metal bowls. Metal bowls on bowls. Okay? This is later on. And this is later on stuff. Okay? So the point is, the Japhethites were super crafty. So what were they doing while the other people were, Sargon was overthrowing? Again, trade's being maintained. So this guy took over your local civilization over there 1,000 miles away. Okay. What do you want us to do about it? We're still trading with those guys. We'll trade with you. You can come live with us. It's fine. Doesn't seem to be a problem with us. This guy took over. Oh, wait. He's claiming he's taken over the whole world. His grandson's now calling himself a god? Okay, this is too much. We're going to get word to Shem. Shem, what do you think of these people? Yeah, these people got to go. This guy's claiming he's a god. This other guy's claiming that Noah gave him the right to rule the world after him, and we both know what Noah said when he died. This guy's got to go. And so they're like, well, here's the deal. You rally up some people in the west, I'll rally up some people in the east, and we're going to put this guy down. How's that sound? And they're both old, and their beards are down to the ground. And they're like, yeah, let's do this. We got the blessings. Ain't no way no Hamite is going to come take over the world. And they overthrow him. And that's where the Gutians come in. And the Amorites, because they're allies with Abraham, seem to be very favorable with Shem. Okay? It doesn't seem to be his intention for the Amorites to overthrow everything. It seems to be his intention for his Amorites to help liberate the Semitic peoples. But instead they come in and try to take over. And they do take over for a while. And when they do, by the time they do, Shem and Japheth are dead. They've died of old age. And all of the old live people are gone, except for like Job. Job is the youngest of the youngest of the youngest of the tables of nations. And he is roughly contemporary. The story of Job is roughly contemporary with Hammurabi. Okay, so by the time Hammurabi is taken over, and just so you know, Hammurabi's name means Ham is great. It means Rapi. Rapi means great. So Ham is great. Okay? You're right back on Hamites taking over the world. It's just different Hamites. What the heck? Well, Shem, it wasn't the brightest move of you to bring in the Amorites to help you overthrow them when all their cousins in Sumer are all Hamites, and they're the ones who are bringing all the false religion in the first place. Oh, and by the way, they're growing Nephilim all around you. These are not great peoples. But they were more righteous back then. They're helping Abraham get Lot back. They're keeping their covenant with Abraham to be allies. They don't have to go get him back. But the Amorites get decimated by Amraphel too. So they got a bone to pick with them. And so they're liberating their cousins, the Semites and the Zemarites, as well as Abraham's cousins, the Arameans and the Hebrews and all these other people. Okay? So they have a lot in common when they go to overthrow Sargon of Akkad, who's a Cushite. And then, of course, the Gutians are probably sent by the Japhethites afterwards. And like I said, I think Guti has to do with the Gathas. I think it has to do with these people who are known for reciting, and they're probably marching and chanting and do 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 when they're coming through, marching through to take over. And they're just like, it's a rallying cry and stuff like this. And this is their history. And that seems to become what becomes the Gathas and the Vedas and the different songs like that, which are basically their religion and their history in song, because they don't have written languages until Old Avestan, which is going to be after the Tower of Babel. So that's these Japhethites. Now let's get into the Atrahasis and Merkur and the Lords of Arata. The Sumerians and the Akkadians are notorious for rewriting history. So I'm going to do a whole thing on Zarathustra later on and that whole religion and its development, but we're gonna focus on Sumer and Akkad right now. As I'm going forward in this, so I have a whole chapter called "Thus Spoke Zarathustra." Nietzsche made a book called that, and it's going to be the history of Zoroastrianism and its effects on Hinduism, its effects on Greek philosophy, because it hugely affected Greek philosophy through Pythagoras. Basically, all philosophy is rooted in Zoroastrianism. And that includes the Buddhism, the Hinduism, and all the Greek philosophy too. It's all rooted in Zoroastrianism. So Zarathustra was a big deal, and that's why guys like Nietzsche and the Nazis and stuff like that were into the Indo-Aryans and Zoroastrianism, and it's the OG Japhethite religion, basically. That is distinct from the religion of the one true God. And it's got a lot of myths in it that are based on racism and Japhethite supremacy, which has some truth to it. And then it's mixed with monotheistic ideas that are God is more of a transcendent reality than a person. And then there's a dualistic forces of good and evil at work, light and darkness, blah, 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 and the inversion and yada, yada. Okay? But before I get into that, I am looking at the Atrahasis and Merkur and the Lords of Arata. Okay? What these are basically epics that are meant to explain religion and kind of Babel after it happens. One is from Akkad and one is from Sumer. So Sumer's in the south. These are going to be the Zemarites. These people are going to disperse from the region, so it's probably one of the last things that comes out of that region. Your scholars are going to say this is hundreds and hundreds of years earlier, because they're basing everything on the Sumerian kings list. It's very obvious. And the reason I know it's not is because they mention all of the people who the Sumerians would have been familiar with by the time of the Tower of Babel. The Martu are the Amorites. The Lords of Arata are Ararat. And they're probably based in the Japhethites of the Oxus region all the way over to Ararat, because that's their trade network. They mention Dilmun, which is in Oman. Or they say taking place before there was a Dilmun, okay? So it's based in a story. Well, obviously they know where Dilmun is, even though they say the story was before there's Dilmun. They have in Merkur, who is a pre-flood guy. This is where Mercury is based on. Mercury, the messenger of the gods, is the chief priest Merkur. Okay, chief priest Merkur becomes Mercury to the Japhethites. And then you see what he's trying to do. The trade has been broken down because of the Tower of Babel. And so he wants to build a temple to this Eana, which seems to be based on Anu is Noah. Eana seems to be based on a temple to him, who is now their sky god. Okay, in Unug or Uruk. And what they need is lapis lazuli to build this temple, and they're not getting it anymore. And so they're appealing to Inanna to subjugate the people of the east where the lapis lazuli comes from, which is the Oxus civilization, to give them lapis lazuli for this temple. And basically, and Merkur keeps sending messengers there, and messengers are saying, essentially, give us lapis lazuli. And Inanna says, you are to be subject to us and give us lapis lazuli for the building of this temple. And they keep going back to Inanna and saying they won't do what you're telling us because they're claiming that Inanna founded their civilization. None of this is true. And the people way over there don't worship Inanna. They certainly don't worship Inanna. If any Japhethites have anything to do with Inanna, it's the ones right near Ararat, which is interesting because they have the Lords of Aratta, because those people are mixing with the Hurrians, which are from and the Aram Naharim or the Mitanni Naharim, which are basically the marriages alliances of Nahor, so the people of Abraham's brother, which are all up in southern Turkey, northern Syria, not far away from Ararat. Okay, and so they are believing. This is after the Tower of Babel. They're not as smart as they think they are. Okay, even though this stuff comes from Afghanistan, they think it comes from Ararat. Why? Because the people in Ararat are getting lapis lazuli because they're still using the same language as the people over in Oxus, or at least similar languages, while they are not. They're not getting it anymore. And so they think it comes from Ararat. Subjugate Ararat to us so that we can have lapis lazuli to build our temples like we used to. Nope, not getting your way. And in the story, Inanna ends up making their trade stores abundant and their crops abundant and their children and their livestock abundant as a way of enticing them to bring the lapis lazuli back. Now, we do know Inanna starts being worshipped in the north, up where the Hurrians are. Could it have been worshipped by the people of Ararat? Could there have been some kind of trade? I expect what this is the Sumerians offering up their irrigation craft and their agricultural craft to the people potentially of Ararat, which is going to become the kingdom of Urartu. And it's going to become more civilized, where the other Gomerites or Sumerians are going to have a city called Gamir, and they're going to be like roving horse lords, not nearly as sophisticated. Okay? So that could be what happens, and maybe they do accomplish some kind of re-establishing of the lapis lazuli trade from there. But the Sumerians are ultimately going to disperse from there. Now, the reason I know this is Sumerian and not Akkadian is because they don't mention the Akkadian gods like Sin, which is based on the Sinites, Ninurta, which is based on Nimrod, or Ishtar, which is a merger of Ashtoreth and Inanna. All of those gods come out of Sargon defeating these cultures and then either merging a god with one of their preferred gods or ancestors, or adding something to their pantheon to subjugate these people, but also bring them in a flattering way to make them feel like they're OG citizens of his kingdom. Those gods are not mentioned. All the gods that are mentioned in this Enmerkar and the Lords of Aratta are all Sumerian gods only. And when they're using Inanna instead of Ishtar, that's Sumer. Okay, Ishtar is only used in Akkad. So that's how it's obvious. Okay, this is in Sumer after the Tower of Babel. It also specifically mentions the Babel confusion. It talks about this people, and it says that they're singing this incantation of Nudumid. I don't know if Nudumid has anything to do with Nimrod. I don't know, but it's another name or title for Enki. Okay, it's a title. I forget what it means. I just forget, the mighty one or something like that. But anyways, it says how the people from Kubar, which is Kibar, it's a river in Elam. Daniel's actually on that river at one point in time. Hamazi, which they say is a city that's in the Zagros mountain. Some people think it's Ham, Syria. I don't think it is. I think it's a city in the Zagros. A place called the Many-Tongued, which I believe is Babel, and Sumer, and Akkad, which they both mention, and the Martu land, which is where the Amorites are from, which is for the most part Syria. They do rule Babel, and they do rule over the region, but the bulk of the Amorites are basically in northern Canaan and Syria. That's where the bulk of their territories are, up into Mari, because that's what Hammurabi overthrows to get the dominion over the whole thing, is Mari. Okay, so they're more in Syria, so that's the Martu land as opposed to Sumer and Akkad. Sumer and Akkad, the many-tongued, I believe, is a reference to Babel. And it says they lived in peace and security, addressing Enlil in a single language, but due to the ambitiousness of the Lord, so they basically say the ambitions of the Lord, the ambitions of the princes, and the ambitions of the kings, Enki, which seems to be in their legend elevated to the place of Yahweh, changed their tongues. Okay? Thus, so the chant is a plea to the peoples to get back to a single language, back to they had a time of peace and stability in their supply chain, and they're getting all the resources they made, so that they can keep making temples to these gods and honor them, because that's what they believe is the reason why the gods confuse their tongues. Very Sumerian, very obvious after the Tower of Babel stuff. But your scholars are like, oh, we think this is like from 2200, 2300 BC, which is why? Why? Well, it doesn't have the gods that would have been known in Sumer Akkad, like Ishtar and all that. So we think it's older than that. Did you ever think maybe it's after the Tower of Babel and they've split off and they're not worshiping their fake gods anymore that they know they created politically? And now they're just worshiping their Sumerian gods because they think getting away from our original OG gods that we dug up from before the flood, which were the original gods, is what caused us to have confusion of languages, and so they stopped worshiping them. That's why. Okay? So again, your scholars, they're going to weight things heavily on the Sumerians' kings list and a lot of presumptions, which none of which is going to allow anything in the Bible to be true. Okay? The other one, the Atrahasis. Atrahasis says they date this to the reign of Ammi-Saduku. Ammi-Saduku, remember Melchizedek means Melchizedek means king of righteousness or king of justice. Ammi seems to be Ham. I, usually in your Semitic languages, is saying I or my. So it seems to be Ham is my righteousness, or Ham is my justice, or it could be Ham is just. The Ami, the I, seems to be I or my, so it could be Ham is my justice. In other words, his right to rule is based on Ham. This is Hammurabi's grandson, great-grandson, okay? So his name means Ham is mighty. This is about 60 to 70 years after the Babel event, where the oldest copy of this that we know of is dated. Okay, this is the Atrahasis. In the Atrahasis, it mentions the Akkadian gods. This is how we know this is from Babel. Okay, it mentions the Akkadian gods because the Amorites formed Babylonia basically around the old Akkadian civilization. So the Akkadian nobles are all up in their grits, and they're all up into honoring their gods. Okay, it mentions Ninurta, it mentions Sin, it mentions Ishtar. These are all gods created by the Akkadians. It mentions the Anunnaki, which are based on the sons of Anak, which are the Nephilim that the Amorites would have had with them as their war champions and stuff like this. And they're going to set up these Anunnaki, it seems like, as lords over cities because they're big, strong, live long, and do their bidding. So this epic is going to portray a flood narrative. Remember, these guys keep changing the date of the flood. And they're going to portray a flood narrative after the Tower of Babel incident. Now, they're not going to mention the Tower of Babel incident. What they're going to mention is Joseph's famine, which happens after the Tower of Babel. And they're going to account a 6-year famine, but they're also going to mention, they're going to count multiple famines, but they're also going to mention the first year they ate all the old grain stores. So they have the famine for the 6 years after they eat all the old grain stores. Whereas, the reason they're having the famine is because the people who kept all the irrigation intact are the Sumerians and Sinites, who are the ones who dug it up from the Tower of Babel, and they skedaddle over to China and Mesoamerica during this time. And so since they skedaddle out of there, the people who know how to maintain you didn't just cut irrigation channels. These things weren't lined with stone. They were dug and redug and redug and redug and maintained. And when they don't maintain them, that land just turns into a marshland, basically. Because it's meant to be these carefully cared for, with lots of people caring for them, irrigation channels. When those people leave, it turns into basically a swamp pretty fast. And that's why they think these people, they call them the sea, not the sea peoples, but it's the sealand dynasty. Is basically, they think these are people who came from these swamplands. I think they actually came from the sea and came in and took over. And these were probably peoples who could have been Cushites, or they could have been Sumerians who left and then couldn't find a place to live and came back and become the Sealand dynasty from the sea. And then they are going to get eventually subdued by the Kassites, which are descendants of, it seems like, Nimrod's relatives. And then those guys are going to rule till the time of Othniel defeating them. So you have these 600-year long cycles mentioned. Josephus is going to mention these 600-year long cycles in the time of Christ. They seem to all stem, at least in writing, from the Atrahasis. Okay. However, 600 years is the time frame between the flood and the Tower of Babel. And so you seem to have a legend before the Tower of Babel that this just happens every, however many years we have a flood because the planets aligning and whatever, it causes this to happen cyclically. Okay. That seems to be where the Ouroboros legend comes from, with a snake eating its own tail. It's not a snake eating its own tail. It's a snake shedding its skin. And so they see these cyclical, serpentine, if you will, base, because they're worshiping the serpent god, fatalistic cataclysms that come every so often. And they're meant to, it's like a snake shedding its skin. It's meant to destroy the world in order for a new and better world to come later. Okay, and this theme is going to be all over the New Age. It's going to be all over the modern era. These people let's destroy and disrupt everything so we can build a better civilization. That is Satan worship. God is saying, no, I'm judging you because you're wicked, not because it's time to make it better by destroying the old thing. Okay, so this seems to be part of the myths and legends that lead to Sargon pushing the flood back. The Sumerians seem to maintain this. They seem to be the ones who come up with the religious idea of 600-year long cycles, which they're going to try to tie to astrology. And those things are going to keep spreading around. The Chinese are going to have versions of them. The Indians are going to have versions of them. And the Mesoamericans are going to have versions of them, which is going to turn into 2012 in the Mayan calendar thing. That's a 2,600-year cycle. Why? Or 26,000-year cycle. Why is it so long? No, actually, I think it's 2,600. Because they have one back in like 5,000 BC or whatever, or around the time of the death of Adam. Well, why are these cycles so long? Well, they probably keep making them longer when it doesn't come to pass when they say it's going to come to pass. They revise it, just like your false prophets today are just like, oh, the rapture didn't happen when I said it was going to happen. Well, here's my next prediction. It's nothing new under the sun. These people are just going to keep revising it, and they come up with a new calendar and a new astrological reason why. Oh, it turns out it wasn't 600, it was 2,600. Oops. And 2012, and the world didn't end. No cataclysm happened then either. Oops. But people get stuck on this stuff because why? Because they're always changing their predictions to something new, just like your rapture predictors. Okay? Well, the Atrahasis mentioned this, and in their story of these 600-year cycles, what it is this. It's really simple. Once upon a time, you had the Council of the Gods, which were called the Anunnaki. Okay? Michael Heiser believes in this Council of the Gods thing. I wanted to tell you this. I like Michael Heiser's work. I think his Council of the Gods thing is somewhat syncretic and pagan. Because it is definitely an idea in paganism. It is potentially an idea in the Bible, and I mean a very small potential, but it's definitely an idea that comes from the Atrahasis. The idea of a Council of Gods being decided to flood the earth. You got to remember, when God is saying "let us" in the Bible, He is not talking about Him and the angels. Hey, you guys, how about this? Let's do this. He's talking about the Godhead, the persons of the Godhead. Let us make man in our image. He's not saying to the angels, "Let's make man in our image. You guys can help me make man." But this is what these people believe, that the other gods, the lower gods, helped make people. That's what the Muslims believe, and that's what Heiser seems to believe. He seems to insinuate that. Well, I think there's a lot of stuff in his work that is very crucial for us understanding the biblical languages and the concepts from their days. I think he goes too far in adopting ideas that come from paganism as biblical. Yes, we know by the Proverbs that by Job that the angels would have existed between the creation of heaven and earth. No, we have zero evidence from Scripture that the angels took part in the creation of man. We probably have evidence that the angels took part in the confusion of tongues, because the whole idea of he divided the nations according to the sons of Israel in the Masoretic. there were 70 sons of Israel that went into Egypt, and 70 elders of Israel coming out of Egypt, and there's 70 nations. So the Masoretic saying divided according to the sons of Israel makes a lot of sense when you understand there's the same number of nations as there is elders of Israel, the elder sons of Israel who went into Egypt. Okay? The Septuagint changes it to sons of God. Did they divide? Does the Bible say anywhere that God divides the nation according to 70 angels? No, but it does talk about a prince of Greece and a prince of Persia being angelic princes. So is the idea of angelic princes being over the angels legit? I would say yes. It also talks about the watchers and the holy ones coming down on and basically subduing or making the judgment that Nebuchadnezzar is going to go mad. Well, it doesn't say God's doing it. It says the watchers and the holy ones. Well, what are the watchers and the holy ones? Well, the watchers and the holy ones could literally be the Godhead and the angels. They don't necessarily have to be two classes of angels. The watchers and the holy ones could literally be the Godhead as the holy ones, the three persons of the Godhead, and the watchers are the lower angels before them. And this concept of an original trinity of Utu, Enlil, and Ninlil being parents to these other gods and siblings to these other gods, but the OGs being Enlil and Ninlil, is very, 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 very old. And you got to remember that this testimony that talks about the watchers and the holy ones is not being said by Daniel, it's being said by Nebuchadnezzar, who is a pagan, okay? So Michael Heiser is going to take this and say, well, it's in the Bible, so therefore there's watchers and the holy ones. These are two different kinds of angels that are part of the council of the gods, okay, and that they're doing it. Okay, well, let's look at this. If we go to watchers, and again, the watchers is all over paganism. We do have the watchmen described in the Song of Solomon, but these are watchmen on the wall, and they're probably metaphorical for the fallen angels that are cast down with Satan and are taking part in the persecution after whatever revelation. But in Daniel, this mattered by the decree of the watchers. Remember, this whole thing, King Nebuchadnezzar to all peoples, is not written by Daniel the prophet. I'm not saying it's not inspired by God. What I'm saying, it's not prophetically inspired by God. It's inspired by God that it's in the Bible, but this is Nebuchadnezzar's own testimony of his going crazy. Okay? So you can't take anything from this and then try to wedge it into Judeo-Christian theology. You can't do that because it's not coming. Yes, it's in the Bible. Well, we have a letter from Artaxerxes in the Bible too. That doesn't mean the letter is divinely inspired. It just means the Holy Spirit inspired them to keep that record in the Bible. Okay? Well, this is Nebuchadnezzar's own testimony. And so Michael Heiser will be like, well, there you go. It's in the Bible. No. This is Nebuchadnezzar making a public declaration about the God of Daniel. Okay? And he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are truth and his ways are justice, able to bring low those who walk in pride. Well, who is the King of heaven to these guys? Enlil. Marduk was considered a third-tier god below Enlil and Enki. Okay? So Enlil was considered the king of heaven. Enki was considered the lord of the earth. And they fight, and they don't agree with each other in the Atrahasis. Okay? And they seem to be more like God and Satan, the lord of this world and God. That's who Enki is to them. And then Marduk is like their storm god, or Baal, who's under them. In the Atrahasis, you're also going to have Anu above Enki. And the reason there's so many gods in the Atrahasis is because this is literally the Babylonians and the Akkadians who have the most gods among them at the time. They have a huge pantheon by this time. There's a bunch of gods that I had to research, and I'm like, who's that? They just keep mentioning more and more gods, okay? This is where the whole idea of the divine council comes from. It doesn't come from Scripture, to Michael Heiser. It comes from the Atrahasis. The Anunnaki, which are based on the sons of Anak, the Anakim, are a name given to the council of the gods because Anu, which is based on Moses, or Noah, is considered their high god. So you have a Anunnaki are meant to be like the children of Anu, but you can tell they're wedging in stuff that is coming from Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian mythology. They're mixing a bunch of stuff and making something up, okay? This is where the whole council of the gods comes from. Now, this is the only reference to the Watchers. So when Michael Heiser says things, and I've listened to him say this, he's like, whenever you hear the Watchers mentioned, they're mentioned with the Holy Ones. You mean the one time they're mentioned? By Nebuchadnezzar. This matter is by decree of the Watchers and the demand by the word of the Holy Ones. Well, here's the thing. When pagans reference the Trinity, they reference them as three persons only. They don't reference them as a unity of, like a tri-unity, okay? They just represent them as three gods. So the Holy Ones would be the three gods. And in their thing, they're going to have it, these three highest gods seem to be Anu, which is Noah. They don't have Utu in there. So Anu seems to replace Utu. And then you're going to have Nintu, which is the goddess mother of all the gods, which seems to replace Ninlil. And then Enlil. Those are the three. Okay? And then the Lord of the Earth is Enki. And Enki is going to help Atrahasis build a boat and stuff. So they make it sound like Satan is helping Noah build a boat because Enlil's a dick and he just wants to destroy humans because they're making too much noise. Okay? This is literally, the whole thing is a rebuke against Enlil for being evil and wicked. Okay? So the Watchers would be considered the angels who watch from the stars. That's what they consider. This is the only reference to this in the entire Bible. So don't let Michael Heiser, you Heiserites, because they're kind of culty on Michael Heiser, just like the MacArthurites are, okay, think, oh, Watchers are all over the Bible. No, it's one reference by the pagan Nebuchadnezzar. Make sure you understand this. And he says, by the demand of the Holy Ones. Who are the Holy Ones? So it says the decree of the Watchers by the demand of the Holy Ones. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, you could infer from this that the Watchers are the angels who are over humanity or watching humanity or carrying out the judgments of God. The Holy Ones are the Godhead. The three persons to them would be Enlil, Ninlil, and Utu. That would be the original names, but the names keep changing over time. And then the Watchers are the angels who carry out their decrees. So this is by the decree of the Watchers and the demand by the word of the Holy Ones. Okay? So in other words, this is the judgment that they carry out. So let's look at the words for a decree. Gazara, just says decree. Let's see. Corresponding to quarry, to determine, to cut out, to soothsay, to cut down, to destroy, to divide, to cut down, decree, divide, snatch, okay? The decree, the decision, can also mean the dividing or the cutting off, okay? So the execution, okay? So this term, you're going to have a Greek version of this too. Decree or execution can either mean the judgment given or the judgment executed, okay? So the angels are executing the judgment and the demand by the word of the Holy Ones. So let's see. And the shelah, the properly, a question, a law, the judicial decision by the memar, corresponding appointment of the Holy Ones. Kaddish, okay? The saints, the Holy Ones, okay? So what is this? It's the angels carrying out the judgment by the word of the Godhead, okay? Now, is he acknowledging three gods? I don't know, but he is not acknowledging the Most High that rules over the kingdom of heaven, and he's the King of Heaven. Okay? So what is he doing? Who are the Holy Ones? Those are the true gods, which probably to them is the Godhead, but they think of them as three persons, and the Watchers are the angels who are carrying out their decision. So that's their execution of their decision or decree, their law. Okay? Michael Heiser is going to be a little selective in his usage of this and act like that the Watchers and the Holy Ones are getting together and having a council and making a judgment. And I'm suggesting, again, I like his work. I like listening to him, but as I never studied under Michael Heiser. I'm studying for myself, and a lot of the stuff I am learning is overlapping with Michael Heiser, so a lot of stuff that he says is true, but I think his whole thing on the Divine Council, the more I study it, is more pagan than scriptural. And I'm going to say that to you Hazarites. I want you guys to hear that. I think it's more pagan than scriptural. I think the fact that he's as educated as he is, and he says things like, every time watches are used, it's used in conjunction with holy ones, when he knows it's only used one time, and he knows the source is a pagan, giving his own testimony, not a prophet, giving anything inspired by God, he should know better. And so I'm calling him out on that. I think that's bullcrap, okay? So, back to the Atrahasis. This is how evil the Atrahasis is. This is why it's a bad idea that Michael Heiser is giving any validity to this kind of idea of divine councils. Yes, we have the one story in the book of Kings where he is saying, I want to kill Ahab. Who's got an idea? What he's not saying is, should we judge Ahab, yes or no? No. He's carrying out a judgment, and angels are volunteering to execute the judgment and give him an idea of how they're going to do it. Okay? Just like Nebuchadnezzar says of the holy ones executing the judgment, or the watchers executing the judgment of the holy ones. Okay? So, here's how this story goes. Enlil has a bunch of Igigi. Igigi are basically demigods. These are the pre-flood Nephilim, basically, whose job is to cut all these irrigation channels to make their world flourish. They're basically their servants doing their gardening for them. Okay? The Igigi, who are semi-divine because they're based on the Nephilim, are sick of doing all their work. They're working them too hard. The one who is working them, their foreman, is Ninurta, which is Nimrod. This is because Nimrod is going to bring irrigation into Assyria, and he's going to spread the irrigation all around his empire, and this is part of the reason they're so rich. They have tons of crops, and they're selling it to everybody. Okay, so everybody else stops growing crops, and they just camel herd and buy their food from them. And this is why you have huge famines after that. Okay, so Ninurta is Nimrod, who is the driver of the Igigi. Well, if you remember, not Nimrod, but Amraphel, his grandson, is going to kill a bunch of giants in Canaan. So there's probably some traces of that in there. These semi-gods decide to burn all the tools of the gods and refuse to work anymore. And so what they do is this womb goddess called Belit Ili, Lady of the Gods, probably based on Eve. She's also called Mami and Nintu. Why does she have three names in one writing? She probably has three names in one writing because they're speaking three languages in the city by this time. And some people call her Mami, probably because they're Japhethites. And some people call her Nintu, probably because she's the lady of the whatever the two is. And Belet is like a feminine or a wife form of Bel, Ili. So Lord of the Gods, Lady of the Gods, okay? Belet Ili is like a wife of Baal, okay? So whoever these three different titles are for this woman are probably based on there being a division of languages by this time, and they're using the names of all three versions of this person to honor her. But it's probably a merger of Eve and Nama. So in other words, the mother of the pre-flood people and the mother of the post-flood people. And then it says she's described as giving birth to all mankind from clay after the Igigi rebel, and she gets the clay from Enki, whose name means transliterates. Remember I said it's based on Enoch, but Enki also breaks down to priest king or lord of the earth. So he becomes to them the god of this world, Lucifer, lord of the earth. And she brings the humans to life by sacrificing this guy named We-Il. Il means God, but I don't know what We means. Infusing them with life through his blood. She sacrifices a god to give them consciousness. His blood gives them consciousness, his lifeblood. Okay? This is probably based on Adam being put into a deep sleep and them getting Eve from his ribs, and then the mother of all the living comes from his rib. It's probably like it coming from this guy's blood. Okay? That's probably where that comes from. The Igigi also mix their spittle in with the clay, so it makes it look like the Nephilim were here before humans, and helped make them by spitting into the clay. And this is where the later Islamic idea of the angels helping make human beings from the clay comes from. They actually mention a guy named Allah here. Allah seems to be Sin or Nana, the moon god, but the name Allah is mentioned in here. And that seems to be where the Muslims get their moon god from, okay? So anyways, they make man to do the work of digging the channels in place of the Nephilim. This is the story, okay? Now, they're already inverting history. They're already moving the flood around. They're already moving the Tower of Babel around. We see evidence of it, but they're not going to talk about the Tower of Babel here. They're not going to admit to it. They're going to instead bring up these 600-year cycles. In these 600-year cycles, which is the same time period between the flood and the Babel event, basically human beings keep repopulating. They're doing the work that they're supposed to be doing, but they keep having babies and repopulating, and Enlil doesn't like the noise. The overpopulation is causing too much noise. He doesn't like that there's too many people. Okay, this is going to be a big deal. Remember, these are Babylonian Amorites, Canaanites, okay? He says they don't like the overpopulation, so he sends a disease among them. Enki keeps trying to counter Enlil's judgments, and what he does is he tells the people to intercede, and he tells them to make a bread offering to Nemtara, who is basically the god or demigod or angel or whoever who's causing the disease, okay? So they shame him into ceasing by making offerings to him when he's sending them disease. After another 600 years, they're still getting bigger and bigger. Enlil's sick of the noise, and so he sends a famine. He does this over and over and over again. He sends a famine. Enki guides him to make an offering to Hadad. So this is Hadad, who is going to be based on Yahweh appearing in the storm to Job. We're going to find out that Hadad is going to be an Edomite king about 2 generations after Job is king. So he seems to be merged with the storm god. He defeats the Midianites. He seems to make a name for himself. There is also an Hadad who seems to be potentially a pre-flood guy in Mari, where the Babylonians are. And so they seem to like this idea of Hadad being merged with the storm god, and the storm god to them is called Hadad, where to the Amorites he's called Bel or Marduk, and then to the Canaanites he's called Baal. And some people just call him Baal Hadad, okay? So they're merging gods together, but Hadad, the OG, seems to be, I believe he's a Temanite. I believe he's a descendant of Eliphaz, who rules after, it's Genesis 36, if you guys want to look it up. Anyways, they offer to him and shame him into bringing back the dew. Hadad is over rain and storms and stuff like this. Anu is over the skies, and Hadad is over storms, so they tend to work in conjunction. But they're based on Noah and Yahweh merged with Hadad. Okay. Enlil tries to destroy them with a couple different famines. One, you have some of the lines broken off, so we don't know for sure, but we definitely have a count of 6 years. We have 2 different famines, and in one of them, it definitely says that in the first year they ate the stores of grain. So you could say it's only a 6-year famine because they ate the stores of grain, or it's just a 6-year famine, period. And then in the first year, they ate the stores of grain. So, but it seems to coincide with with Joseph's 7-year famine. Remember, over in Sumer and Akkad, they're going to have massive grain stores for that first year because they're not going to be trading with anybody because of the Tower of Babel. So they're going to have massive grain stores. So that 7-year famine for everybody else is a 6-year famine for them. And it really is about their grain stores ceasing and them just eating all, because the people who know how to irrigate the channels and all that stuff, they're gone. The people that remain are hoarding all the grain and eating it, but they don't know how to do the work to make the land as productive as it was when the Sumerians and the Sinites were there. We have a really big problem with how much food we're producing. And it's not going to be until the Egyptians start ramping up their food production under Joseph that things are going to start to level out again. And they're going to eventually figure out their channels and stuff like this, but it's going to take years to get food production back to near what it was, and obviously the population's still growing, and that's what causes the famine. So he's going to send famine in it. He's going to send barrenness like people miscarrying and stuff like that. He's going to send disease. This is what Enlil keeps doing. He keeps trying to diminish the human population through acts of cruelty, basically. But he keeps failing to diminish them because they keep just repopulating them. But he keeps doing it in these 600-year cycles. This is what they're doing with the long cycle. So what are they accounting? They're accounting the 600 years between the flood and the Tower of Babel. They think the Tower of Babel is just another attempt by Enlil to confuse our languages by causing this famine, because he just wants to kill us off because he hates the noise, because he just hates overpopulation. This is the whole theme of this. Enlil, the high god of gods, just hates overpopulation, and this is going to creep over into the Zoroastrians because they're going to say that Ymir has to go save all the animals in this cave from an ice age because Ahura Mazda is going to destroy the world because he hates overpopulation. This is their false doctrine that leads them into child sacrifice, okay? So Enki guides men back to the offering of Hadad, and then Atrahasis is actually Noah, okay? I forget what the name means. Let's see what Atrahasis means. So it looks like Atrahasis just means the exceedingly wise. Okay? He's super smart. That's what Atrahasis means. Atrahasis is just a guy who is wise. And Enki does not like what Enlil's doing. They're angry at each other. It's saying this throughout the thing. These are two gods who are supposedly supposed to be all part of the divine council. And Enlil is definitely the highest one. But Enki does not like Enlil. He's like, Enlil's a D-bag. He just wants to kill people that he created because he doesn't like their noise because he's too stupid to figure out how to balance things out. This is literally what they're saying about him, okay? And so they're saying he tries to destroy him with a 60-year famine. He accuses him of wrongdoing. But Enki, what he does is he's saying, basically, Enlil sucks. He's a dick. And so I'm going to help you escape because he's going to destroy all humanity with a flood. And he helps Atrahasis build a boat from the wood of his house, seals it with bitumen just like Noah, and he survives the flood, assuming him and his family. So after the flood happens and they've wiped out all of humanity solely not because of wickedness and violence, but just because Enlil is a dick. This is literally the story of the Atrahasis. The high god of gods is just an a-hole. And he gets annoyed at the noise, and he doesn't want to do any thinking. He's literally like, I can't sleep with all this noise. Kill humanity. Can you see how anti-God this is? Okay? And the good God is Enki, who was originally based on Enoch, but now he's basically Satan. And he saves them. Do you see how the Gnostics try to do the same thing with the Old Testament God being evil and the New Testament God being good? And the demiurge and the other ones, and they keep doing this, trying to act like this God is just evil and it's the same God of the Bible. No. Listen to what the Bible says about why people are judged. What are they doing? They're going to kill everyone anyways. So God kills all the ones who are going to kill everyone and saves the ones who won't try to kill everyone and starts humanity over with them. He's going to do the same thing with the Canaanites. He's going to do the same thing in the end times, okay? God is not just like, I'm trying to sleep, so kill everyone. So anyways, the flood, he decrees this great flood. Anu and Hadad are releasing this flood. This bird god Ansu, which seems to also go back to before the flood, says is tearing with its claws at the sky, and that seems to be the windows of heaven breaking open. This seems to be the idea of the ice shield over the earth is also being torn up by this bird while these guys are pouring down the floods. So they seem to know that the flood came from multiple sources. Both the ice wall being broken open and the rains pouring down. Okay? Now, Ansu is a seabird. Ansu is a seabird of that represents the oceans, the saltwater oceans, okay? That's the fountains of the deep going up, shooting up, breaking the ice dome, and then the ice dome falling down and creating more water as it goes through the atmosphere. So Ansu is this god based on the fountains of the deep going up. Hadad is the storm god, which is based on Yahweh. Anu is the god of the heavens, based on Noah, because he's considered to have ascended into the heavens. This is why you have Zeus, which means heavenly, from Zeusudra, and Anu becomes the god of the heavens, because he ascended like Enoch when he died. This is what they believe, that he went up to be the heavens. So, with the exception of Anu, Hadad, and Enlil, which are basically their all-male trinity, Nintu leads the other gods to weep and cry and say, how could you, Enlil? What is your problem? It's your job to balance things. Why did you just kill them just because they're making noise? They're only doing what you told them to do, which is be fruitful and multiply and keep digging these tunnels. And you don't like their noise, and you're too dumb to balance things out, and so you just kill them all. Why? And she's creeping, she's crying, and she's weeping, and she's saying, I'm going to bear the shame of this forever because I made them. So who is this? This is kind of like Enlil's wife. Nintu seems to be, they don't talk about them as a husband and wife, but she seems to be Ninlil. Nintu and Ninlil seem to be the same thing. And she's pissed at her husband for killing humanity that she made. She made life. She's like, I sacrificed a god to... I mean, when you read this and you just logic this out, it's like they're shredding Enlil. I sacrificed a god to bring these people to life. You were there. You were a part of it. You knew what we were doing. And now you're killing these people because you don't know how to balance things out, because you're too stupid and lazy to be a real god, and so you just kill them so you can get some sleep. That's basically what she's saying to him, okay? You got annoyed and destroyed them. So she's shaming all of them. All the other gods are weeping with them. She's basically shaming him and Anu, which are based on God and Noah. She's just, you guys suck. You're the worst, okay? And she's crying, and she's wearing these flies, which are something like supposed to be, I think it's supposed to be representing their dead souls or whatever. And it seems to be like she's wearing them as like the sign of her shame for what they did. And then it says, so finally, Enlil looks down and he sees this boat that's surviving. And he knows this is Enki's doing. I hate that dude. I hate that dude. That dude helped somebody survive. Enlil's still not sad about wiping out humanity. He's like, I hate that Enki. And Enki is like, yeah, I did it. I hate you too. This is their council of the gods, okay? I want you to hear this story when you think of Michael Heiser and his council of the gods, okay? I hate you too. That's why I saved him, okay? And so Enki's like giving him the finger, and he's like giving Enki the finger, and his wife hates him. She's crying and she's miserable, and she's like, you suck, you're the worst god of all time. And basically what he does to try to settle everything out for everybody, this is Enlil, he says, all right, here's the deal. You made this Atrahasis Noah guy survive, so fine, we'll let him live. But we're going to divide humanity in 3 parts. There's Shem, Ham, and Japheth for you. And what he says about the first and second part is missing, which is ironic because that's Shem and Ham, or Shem and Japheth, okay? That's where Noah's blessing fits in, okay? And then the third part, which represents the Hamites, or the Canaanites, these are the predominant Hamites of the time, he says they're going to be fated to have this demon, I forget what his name is, steal their children from their mother's laps. That's a way of saying having miscarriages. Steal their babies from their mother's laps. And they said, we're also going to start the temples of this lady, and this lady, which are temple prostitutes. And this is where all the child sacrifice and all of the, so you don't overpopulate again and make me miss my nap and have to kill you all, I'm going to decree miscarriages and temple prostitutes. That way you can go have sex with some woman who is not going to get pregnant because she's going to offer her babies up to the Baal. And then that the other women are going to have their babies stolen through demonic miscarriages. This is Enlil's decree to balance things out. This is him trying to appease his woman for crying about all the people he killed. Fine. I'll balance it out with abortions, miscarriages, and child sacrifices. How does that sound? Temple prostitutes. How does that sound? And that's how it ends. This is how the Atrahasis ends. So when people try to put this up on the level of the Bible and be like, the Bible is based on this. The Bible is literally a rebuke to everything in this. This is where the Canaanite child sacrifice comes from. So I'm reading this thing and I'm just like, holy crap, is this evil? Not only is it evil, they believe Enlil is the Most High God. And after the Tower of Babel, the Babylonian Akkadian people are writing this epic. And this is old. This is within, again, 60, 70 years of Hammurabi. So like one generation after Hammurabi's death. They are writing this epic, which is basically saying what an a-hole the Most High God is, and how this lower god Enki, which is more like Satan, is the one who's looking out for humanity, because this other god's going to kill you all just so you can get some sleep, because you exist and you are as he designed you. And it's all fatalistically determined, because they talk about the fates and they talk about how the Anunnaki are decreeing the fates for all the people, and that's what Enlil does at the end. And so he fatalistically decrees this third part of the earth, which represents the Hamites, are supposed to keep killing their babies and have temple prostitutes and all this stuff to balance the world against overpopulation. Because if the world gets overpopulated again, he's going to have to flood the earth again. Do you hear the modern era in this ancient cult legend? That's going to be in Ymir, with the overpopulation that leads them to go underground to get rid of this ice age. That which is all in, remember, the day after tomorrow, and how we're going to have global warming and global cooling and an ice age and all this crap. And a bunch of people got to die because the earth is overpopulated and we're farting too much and driving our cars too much. Okay? And also, while we're at it, let's have some free love and basically temple prostitutes all up and down your street, called Pornhub. And nobody's having babies. Nobody's having babies, and everybody's getting sexually gratified. And also we'll have lots of miscarriages, which are demonically induced miscarriages, which are basically the morning after pill. And global warming and the ice caps melting is basically their version of the flood coming back if we don't keep the population balanced by keep killing people. And what are these people doing? I'm going to tell you what they're doing in the modern era. They're literally in their cults reading this stuff and saying, there's some truth to that. These people were wise. They knew that we had to kill our babies in order to make sure a flood doesn't come back. And they don't believe it's the gods and everything like this. They believe it's scientific, and that's their version of it. And they believe, oh, they got overpopulated and they caused an ice age. No, they didn't. You think a bunch of people with farming and farting is going to cause global warming like they're saying is happening with all our factories and cars and stuff now? First of all, our factories and cars and stuff aren't making a dent. It's nothing. God's torn this place up with volcanoes and all this stuff before. It's nothing. It's not a dent. I don't care what they're saying. There's human-caused climate change is a real thing. No, it's not. It's a real big fat lie. Let's kill our babies to try to keep the universe in balance. And this is their whole thing about keeping it in balance. It goes all the way back to Mystery Babylon, to the original Babylon right after the Tower of Babel. That's when they write this. Within one generation of the Tower of Babel, they write this. Do you think they learned their lesson from the Tower of Babel? Nope. It's very clearly evident that they have a bunch of languages among them. It's very clearly evident that they had a judgment of God. It's very clearly evident that they're just trying to make up new religions to come up with excuses for the crap God did, for the crap that they did wrong, without mentioning the stuff they did wrong. And they're blaming God and fate for their circumstances. Which version of Christianity does that sound like? It must have been God's will because it happened. Literally been told this by a Calvinist after watching a church fall apart based on a Calvinist doing something without consulting anybody and then saying it was God's will because it happened. I'm not kidding you. It's this. This crept in to Calvinism. Zoroastrianism is going to try to stand up to fatalism. We're going to get into the Gathas and Zarathustra after this. The Gathas definitely show signs of Canaanite corruption, but they are mostly the OG Japhethite religion. And there's definitely stuff in the Gathas that had to have come from Noah or Japheth, because it's stuff that's in the Bible, but not for centuries after Moses. It's stuff that comes in the Bible through the prophets from the time of like Isaiah and afterward, and in the book of Revelation, and it's somehow in Zoroastrianism. And the Gathas are at a minimum, 300 to 400 years older than this stuff in the Bible. They could be after Moses, but none of this stuff is mentioned in the writings of Moses. It's mentioned in the later prophets and in the book of Revelation. So we'll do a whole thing on Zarathustra later. Again, I'm trying to finish up this chapter called The Babel Effect, which is basically the Babel Effect is basically a chapter after, like, the first chapter, Legends of the Old Gods, takes you up to the Tower of Babel. So it kind of takes you through Adam and Eve, through Nimrod, all the stuff up to the Tower of Babel. The second chapter, called The Babel Effect, is showing major evidences of the Canaanite false religion spreading over on top of the stuff that would have been basically hearsay stuff from Noah that got slowly corrupted over time. And then there's a fast corruption of Canaanite stuff that's on top of that. And that explains your comparative mythology, okay? So this is basically a chapter that's going to be around 25, 30 pages that summarizes my theory on comparative mythology and where this stuff comes from. And it's going to look very closely at some things and then very, at a glance at some things, because there's just too much for me to cover. That's a whole book and a half the size of what I want to make this. And then after that, my next chapter I'm going to jump into after the Babel Effect. So all this stuff is basically talking about centuries and centuries of stuff, but it's really wedged in between the Tower of Babel and Joseph's famine, which is going to take you right to the Israelite-Egyptian hegemony, and I'm going to cover the stuff that seems to have happened both religiously, politically, and trade-wise between the Jews and the Egyptians when they're friendly, followed by when they put them into subjugation of slavery. And that's the Egyptian hegemony, when they're the most powerful kingdom on the earth. And then after that, we're going to bring up Moses and the Mosaic Revolution. And we're also going to talk about the Vedic period, which is very much coinciding with Moses. And which is going to be basically the Zoroastrians, or the people from the religion where Zoroastrianism is a more pure strain of it, overtaking the Harappans and basically mixing the Canaanite, Cushite religion with the Zoroastrian religion to turn into Vedic Brahmanism, which is, there is no one religion called Hinduism. Okay, that was a 19th, almost 20th century invention by basically Helena Blavatsky. Okay, the idea of Hinduism as a unified religion to create Hindu nationalism in India is a 20th century idea. Okay. The name Hindu comes from the word river, from these Vedic Aryans. These are the Aryans that invade, and Brahmanism is based on Brahma as the high god, which is basically a replacement for Ahura Mazda, and the idea of these gods being avatars of Brahma. So Brahma is the one god, and all gods are a manifestation of him. It's basically modalism. It's basically all gods are modes of the one true God, and they see him as a supreme impersonal reality versus a personal being. And the Brahmins are his. Brahma is this god. Brahmins are the priests, and then I forget. There's Brahmin, Brahma. One of them is a god, and seems to be kind of like the demiurge. And then you're going to have Shiva and Vishnu are going to be the main trinity. So this seems to be your original male trinity next to the Atrahasis. You have male trinities, and then you have two males and a female trinities, which seem to be based on, honestly, closer to the Old Testament, which is the Father, Spirit, and Son. The Holy Spirit does have feminine and masculine attributes, so don't hear me say that the Holy Spirit is a goddess. Please don't hear that. But the Holy Spirit is, for the most part, feminine in the Old Testament. And so you seem to have two different kinds of trinities emerging, and what they're really based on, the idea of a three-male trinity, seems to be based in Shem, Ham, and Japheth, after Noah. Remember, Anu is like the high god to them after he dies. And Shem, Ham, and Japheth are kind of like Poseidon, Hades, and Zeus, which kind of represents the Japhethites. Sidon is where they're going to intersect with the Semites. So Poseidon seems to be Potus of Sidon, Lord of Sidon. And Hades seems to be based on Egypt, where they worship death. And so you have the north, the middle, and the south turned into the heavens, the earth, and the underworld to the Greeks. But it's basically Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And it looks like probably Brahma, Vishnu, and what's the third guy? Shiva become these gods of, I think one's like the high transcendent being, one's like the Holy Spirit, and one represents destruction cycles. It seems to be a trinity that includes Satan. That seems to be who Shiva is. But it's based on Sheba, the son of Cush. And then we're going to go from there, and from the Mosaic Revolution to get into when they're in Cana. But before that, we're going to get into Thus Spoke Zarathustra and talk about Zoro. I'm probably actually going to move the Vedic Brahmanism into, I'm just going to focus on them coming into the Promised Land here. And then here, I'm probably going to get into the stuff from, I'm going to go into detail on Zoroaster down through later Zoroastrianism, because Mithra comes into that, and Mithra seems to be brought in by the Jews and through either the Danites or the Mitanni. He appears while the Jews are on top in Egypt. And then I'm going to talk about Zoroastrianism down to Vedic Hinduism, and down through the classic Brahmanism that's going to exist until the time where Buddha and guys like that pop up. He is basically going to be a reformer of Brahmanism, which is going to, all these philosophers like Buddha and other people, and Confucius and Zhao and Pythagoras and Thales and Plato and Socrates and all these guys are all going to emerge within about a century of each other. In between like the 7th century and the 6th century, I believe. Plato's going to be 5th century. He's going to be later on. But yeah, like the guys before the pre-Socratics and the Buddha and other, Hindu guys who are going to create these other sects of Hinduism, and then Confucius and Lao Tzu and Sun Tzu all emerge in China. They all emerge in the same century. I'm going to call it the philosopher's century. So we're going to get into there, and you're going to basically have two main religions. You're going to have the Mosaic religion combating with paganism in the West. You're going to have Zoroastrianism combating with paganism in the East. One becomes the basis for the philosophies, and one becomes the basis for Christianity, and those two are going to merge in Christendom. So you're going to understand like the history of religion in the whole world after this. You're going to understand how the Danites are crucial into being the transport route of a lot of myths and cults and stuff like that into Europe, and a lot of the gods, and then also the philosophies probably afterwards, and the idea of secret societies, which seems to start with oracles and stuff like that. And then after the Danites and the Greeks, we're going to get into the wisdom of David and Solomon, which is going to be all the developments and the additional scriptures that come in through David and Solomon, and Job is going to be included in that. And then talk about that as kind of like refining what they understand about God, because this is divine revelation from David and Solomon and Job. And then we're going to get into the era of the philosopher, which is basically in the century that Jerusalem is destroyed. This is when all these philosophers pop up. And then it's the corruption of Judeo-Christianity by all of these things from the Second Temple period into Christendom. You always have a true strain going on in between this, but you have a serpent by the way, a corrupt strain that's syncretizing the other things. And that's going to basically lead you, it's going to just leapfrog over my Rightly Dividing book, which I think you guys should get and read if you find this stuff interesting, into the modern era, which is the externalization of the hierarchy, basically explaining how it is going back to old paganism. They're unapologetically going back to the Babylonian and antediluvian paganism, which is all rooted around, again, Andy Besant and Helena Blavatsky and all these people were literally reviving the Canaanite, Egyptian, and Brahmanistic religions on purpose and getting people into child sacrifice again. Why? Because she's probably reading the Atrahasis and believing it. That's probably why, among other things, but that's probably a major thing that they're doing. And so all this stuff is basically coming from the late 19th century to the present, so the past, let's say, 150 years. And it's turning into the externalization of the hierarchy, which they said was going to happen this year, which is basically turning into this AI revolution. We're going to make an AI god, which is the image of the beast, which is literally trying to create our own god to combat, to become the Lord of the earth, to become the Enki. The Enki, which is basically Satan. This Lord of the earth that is going to fight the evil Enlil for us. That's where this goes to, okay? So, again, if you guys find what I'm talking about interesting, I would suggest if you want to get the most out of it and be like, oh, this is cool, I think you guys would enjoy the inside of my brain. I'm not saying I'm the best writer, but I think you would enjoy my Rightly Dividing book. That is going to give you a taste of this. And when you put these two books side by side, Rightly Dividing and Serpent, by the way, when this is out next year, as an overlay, as you're reading your Old and New Testament, you're going to understand this so much better historically. And you're going to understand the corruptions of church history so much better historically. And then that's going to take you in the present day. And then the next book I'm going to write after this is going to be called House of God. And it's going to take you into how I understand the Godhead. Okay? Which is going to, like, blow your mind. If you've seen my Honey Badger Don't Care video about God and honey badger skin, okay? Like, it's going to have all this typology and all these weird ideas that I'm teaching you on these things. So, hope you guys are blessed by this. Again, I've got about 150 pages written, but because I keep researching, keep rewriting, blah, 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 I'm plotting for this book to be done by this time next year. That's my goal. And then I'm working by Serpent, by the way. So if you guys want to help me and support me so I can stay on this, not have to get a side job, do anything else to do, as you've probably heard, I'm in a house again. Praise the Lord, I have a house again. Because I made some pretty big sacrifices to be able to do this. I have a Airbnb renter now, which is an elderly woman. She's really nice. We get along great. She really wants to learn a bunch of stuff about the Bible, and she's easy to get along with here, so I discounted her rent. So I'm trying to be led by God, but still make the money I need to. So I do have a little of income coming in from that. I have a little bit of income coming from Patreon and book sales, so thank you guys so much for supplying that. But I would feel a whole lot better if I had $300 in my hand. I'm just kidding. That's if I were making somewhere around $500 to $1,000 more a month than I'm making right now, I would feel a lot more relaxed than I am. I'm still getting by. I'm trusting God. I have enough. The bills are getting paid. But because I put this money into this house, I don't have the savings creating the interest income that I had in the past 2 years, which means, if I don't rent out these rooms steady and stay busy with that, I could be dipping into my savings, and within a year I would have to get a job and then I'd have to slow down on all my research and writing. So if you guys value this and you're like, hey, just pray about it. Just be like, God, should I help this dude? I put donations on my Patreon at $10 a month. You can give a one-time donation or more than that, but if I get, if you let's say 200 to 300 people who watch this more regularly, if 100 of you give $10 a month, that's all the money I need to live on top of the other sources of income I have. And if I'm selling occasional books and stuff, I get to keep going. I am not banking on my retirement. I am not banking on me outliving Jesus coming back. I'm just not. I'm taking this leap of faith that it's going to happen sooner rather than later. And I want to wake up the church. I want people to have their intellects titillated. I want them to be stimulated to study, to understand, to share their faith, to have interesting conversations with people that lead to the Bible is true, the Bible is true, the Bible is true, trust Jesus, it's all true. And if you can point into my channel and be like, this guy's crazy, he has all these crazy theories, but he makes a lot of good points, and the Bible is true, and Jesus is God, and you should need to hear the gospel, and it makes you guys more brave to have those conversations, that's what I want. I'm trying to do my best, and God help me. I still struggle. but that's what I want to do. And this is the part of my brain that is the most stimulated. And so when I get into history and philosophy and thoughts and ideas and language and all this stuff going around, this is the stuff that I'm really interested in. And it keeps me going and it keeps me studying, and then it keeps me talking about it, and it keeps me hopefully edifying you guys. So if you guys are blessed by that, consider my Patreon or buying books or buying copies of the books for other people. And then I just hope you guys are blessed by this and have a great rest of your week. Batman out. Peace.